In the desert silence of ancient Egypt, the world was not divided neatly between life and death, but instead stretched out in layers of sand, shadow, and eternity. The Nile cut through the land as the only source of life, its waters feeding fields and villages, its flood marking the rhythm of existence. Beyond its fertile banks lay another reality altogether, a barren wasteland of rock and shifting dunes. For the Egyptians, this was not just a place where no one lived. It was a boundary, a threshold that led to the unknown. The desert devoured the careless, swallowed cities, erased paths, and consumed bodies. And when people looked out into that vast silence, they imagined eyes watching back. Those eyes belonged to the jackal. The animal that haunted the edges of their world became the first and most enduring face of death. Jackals moved with precision. They appeared at night when the villages fell silent, their paws leaving no sound in the sand, their silhouettes sliding between rocks and tombs. They were scavengers by nature, clever survivors who could sniff out the faintest trace of decay. Egyptians saw them circle the necropolises, lingering near freshly covered graves, digging into shallow earth with relentless persistence. To see them was to be reminded that death was not an end, but a process, that the body which had been cared for and honored could be torn open and consumed if it was not protected. The jackal embodied both danger and inevitability. It could destroy, but it also revealed the need for guardianship, for divine protection against the chaos that followed death. Instead of trying to banish this image, the Egyptians embraced it. They transformed the jackal into a god, Anubis, whose task was not to kill but to watch, not to scatter the dead but to preserve them. His form became iconic almost immediately, a man's body crowned with the sleek, narrow head of a jackal, ears pricked, muzzle long and pointed, eyes eternally alert. His skin was black, not because jackals were, but because black was the sacred color of both death and rebirth. It was the hue of the fertile silt deposited by the Nile each year, the soil in which new life grew after the flood. It was also the color of flesh after embalming, darkened by the resins and oils of preservation. Anubis wore black because he was not only the darkness of the tomb, but also the promise that life could be renewed through ritual. His body, lean and controlled, suggested patience and vigilance. He crouched like a predator ready to spring, yet his gaze was steady, as though nothing could surprise him. He was the silent guardian at the edge of the grave, the one who never slept. From the earliest dynasties, long before Osiris was raised to kingship over the dead, Anubis was supreme among mortuary gods. In the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings of Egypt, he is called the foremost of the Westerners, a title that placed him at the head of those who had crossed into the land beyond life. The West, where the sun disappeared each evening, was the symbolic direction of death. Every burial faced that way, every soul was imagined to travel toward it. To be called foremost of the Westerners meant that Anubis was not a minor figure lurking in the shadows. He was the leader of all who had died, the one who guided them into the eternal dusk. His power was not just symbolic, it was practical. Without him, no one could hope to navigate the perilous journey into the afterlife. To the living, his presence began at the tomb itself. Statues of the jackal crouched at the entrance, their eyes painted to follow intruders, their sleek bodies lying across the threshold. They warned grave robbers that the tomb was not unprotected, that the wealth of the dead was guarded by a divine force that saw everything. Yet, for families and mourners, the same statues were a comfort. They were evidence that their loved one had not been abandoned to rot in the desert. Anubis was there, silent but vigilant, ensuring that no force, human or supernatural, would disturb the eternal rest. The duality of fear and reassurance lay at the heart of his identity. He was terrifying if you came to desecrate, but a blessing if you came in reverence. He was impartial, his judgment shaped entirely by intent. The rituals of embalming placed Anubis at their center. Priests wore masks in the shape of his jackal head, speaking as him, moving as him, becoming him in the eyes of the community. These rites were not symbolic pageantry, but sacred reenactments of a myth as old as Egypt itself. The story told that when Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, it was Anubis who gathered the broken body. He cleansed it, wrapped it, and restored it with his divine skill, creating the first mummy. In doing so, he prevented Osiris from decaying into nothingness. He preserved him, allowing him to rise again, not in the world of the living, but as ruler of the dead. Every embalming ritual repeated this primordial act. Each body wrapped in linens, each organ carefully preserved, each charm placed among the wrappings was a recreation of that first divine embalming. Anubis was present in every gesture, ensuring that no mortal was left without the same chance of survival. The Egyptians believed that without preservation, the soul could not continue its journey. The body was not a shell to be discarded, but a vessel that had to be maintained, so the spirit had an anchor. Anubis embodied this principle. He was not the god of death as annihilation, but of death as transition. His role was not to end life, but to prepare it for what came next. He was the custodian of the most important threshold in human existence. That role made him one of the most universally respected gods in the pantheon. Unlike the volatile deities of war or the distant gods of the sky, Anubis was approachable, reliable, constant. Death came for everyone, and so did he. Images of him leading the dead appear throughout Egyptian art. On papyri placed in tombs, he is shown taking the hand of the deceased, guiding them through halls lined with gods and spirits. He escorts them to the scale where the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the principle of truth and justice. He does not bend the scales or alter the outcome. He ensures fairness. If the heart is heavy with wrongdoing, Amit, the devourer, waits to consume it. If it is light, the soul is welcomed into the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal harvest and abundance. Anubis himself does not punish, nor does he reward. He is the guarantor that the process cannot be corrupted. He embodies the certainty that death is impartial. For the Egyptians, this impartiality was profound. In life, status could shape outcomes. Kings wielded power, officials bent laws, wealth could buy privileges. In death, none of this mattered. Before Anubis, a king and a farmer were equal. The scale recognized only the weight of truth. This equality gave his presence a quiet authority that few other gods held. He was incorruptible, immune to bribes or petitions. Death, through him, was the great leveler. At night, when the desert cooled and the stars spread across the sky, jackals could be heard calling, their cries echoing across valleys of stone. To Egyptians, this sound was not random. It was the voice of the god himself, reminding them of the boundary that separated their fragile lives from eternity. To walk in the necropolis at night was to feel watched, not just by animals, but by something far older, something woven into the very order of the universe. The presence of Anubis was everywhere, in the silence of the tomb, in the oil lamps of the embalmers, in the prayers whispered by grieving families. He was not confined to temples or distant myths. He was at the very edge of every life, waiting patiently, endlessly. The black jackal in the desert night was more than an image. It was a certainty. Egyptians did not imagine their deaths without him. No burial was complete without invoking his protection, no journey into the afterlife possible without his guidance. He was both the threat that the desert posed and the assurance that it could be overcome. He prowled where no one else dared, and in his vigilance the people found solace. To them, he was not just the scavenger of graves, but the guardian who made eternity possible. The tomb was never just a place to deposit the dead. In Egypt, it was a threshold, a carefully designed meeting point between two worlds. Every block of limestone, every painted wall, every carved inscription was an attempt to bridge the fragile distance between the living and the departed. For those who built them, tombs were not houses of decay, but eternal dwellings. They were made to last beyond dynasties, beyond empires, beyond the slow grinding of sand and time. And yet, no matter how massive the construction, no matter how elaborate the ritual, a tomb without a guardian was vulnerable. The Egyptians understood this better than any other civilization of their age. They filled their necropolises with a god who watched over the threshold with eternal vigilance. That god was Anubis. To stand at the door of a tomb in the ancient world was to feel the weight of his presence. The statues carved in his image were not casual decorations. They crouched low, sleek and predatory, painted in black, with eyes that seemed to watch even as the torchlight flickered across their polished surfaces. They were positioned deliberately, facing outwards, guarding the entrance against intrusion. A grave robber might look upon these figures and see only stone, but for the Egyptians, those statues were alive with power. They were vessels into which the god could flow at will, forms that carried his gaze and extended his authority into the physical world. No one crossed the threshold without acknowledging that they were entering a space under Anubis's protection. The silence of the tomb door was its own warning. Unlike the temples which rang with hymns and music, the tomb was hushed. Offerings were placed in silence, words whispered instead of sung. To disturb the quiet was to invite attention from forces that were not human. Anubis thrived in that silence. He was not a god of festivals or public celebrations. He did not parade in the daylight with banners and priests. He lingered at the margins, in stillness, in the kind of quiet that magnified every sound. A shuffled step, a cough, the faint clink of a jar. These noises became amplified at the tomb entrance. In such a space, the imagination quickened. The black jackal was near, unseen but certain, waiting just beyond the door. The Egyptians knew that death was not only a passage, but a place of danger. The spirit, once released, did not glide peacefully into eternity. It had to navigate an underworld full of obstacles, demons, gates, and trials. The tomb was the launch point of that journey. Without proper guardianship, the soul might falter before it even began. Anubis's role was to ensure that did not happen. He was the silent escort who opened the way, the one who made sure that the threshold itself was not corrupted. To cross into the tomb without him was unthinkable. He was the gatekeeper, both for the living who entered to give offerings and for the dead who passed through to begin their transformation. This role gave him a unique authority among the gods. While Osiris reigned over the underworld and Ra illuminated the sky, Anubis alone controlled the door. No one reached Osiris without first passing his gaze. No offering reached the dead without first being seen by him. He was the liminal figure, standing where two worlds touched, and that position gave him an influence unmatched by more distant deities. To be liminal was to be dangerous. It was to belong fully to neither world, but to move between them freely. Anubis could not be trapped in the routines of the living, nor was he bound entirely by the laws of the dead. He was both and neither, and that ambiguity was his strength. Archaeology has revealed how carefully this guardianship was woven into Egyptian practice. In the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs were buried in massive tombs carved into cliffs, black wooden statues of Anubis have been found stationed at the entrances to burial chambers. These figures were not placed randomly. They were meant to face intruders directly, confronting anyone who dared to enter uninvited. In one famous example from the tomb of Tutankhamun, a life-size statue of Anubis crouches on a shrine, his ears alert, his painted eyes gleaming. Even after 3,000 years, the effect is unnerving. It is as though the god himself is crouched in the darkness, waiting. For ancient Egyptians, that effect was the point. It made the boundary unmistakable. This was not just a room filled with treasures, it was a sacred threshold, and only those who came with reverence and the proper rituals could hope to cross it safely. To the Egyptians, doors were not simply physical barriers, they were spiritual symbols. A door marked a boundary between two states of being, and crossing it was never a trivial act. To pass through a tomb door was to cross from the ordinary into the sacred. The inscriptions carved on the lintels often made this explicit. They invoked Anubis by name, calling upon him to guard what lay beyond, to strike down those who violated the sanctity of the dead, and to grant safe passage to those who came bearing offerings. These inscriptions made clear that the tomb was not abandoned. Even if no living relative returned for centuries, the god remained eternal and tireless, keeping his watch. In this guardianship, Anubis was not cruel. He did not lash out without cause or consume the living indiscriminately. His wrath was reserved for those who attempted desecration. For mourners, priests, and family, he was a silent companion. His presence at the door gave them assurance that their prayers would reach the one they had lost, that the offerings of food and drink would not go astray, that the sacred process of remembrance would remain unbroken. He was not a god of chaos, but of order. His guardianship was the guarantee that the sacred cycle of death and afterlife remained intact. This role as guardian extended beyond individual tombs to entire necropolises. Cities of the dead, such as Saqqara or Abydos, were places where Anubis's presence was overwhelming. The sheer number of burials, the scale of the monuments, the constant rituals of embalming and interment, all of it was his domain. He was called the Lord of the Sacred Land, a title that placed him not just at one tomb, but over the entire landscape of the dead. To walk among the rows of mastabas, the massive, flat-roofed tombs of the Old Kingdom, was to walk in his territory. Every grave, every door, every threshold belonged to him. What made this guardianship particularly striking was its impartiality. Unlike other gods who might favor certain regions, families, or rulers, Anubis's guardianship extended to all. Kings and commoners alike needed him. Whether the tomb was a vast stone pyramid or a simple pit in the sand, Anubis was invoked to guard it. His reach was universal, which made him deeply personal. Every Egyptian, no matter their rank, could imagine his presence at their own tomb. This universality gave him a democratic quality rare in the ancient pantheon. He belonged to everyone. The silence of his guardianship carried psychological weight as well. In a culture that prized ritual speech, hymns and chants, Anubis's silence set him apart. It was not the silence of neglect, but of watchfulness. His stillness implied a readiness to act, a constant vigilance. He was not absent, but intensely present. The Egyptians understood that silence could be powerful, that it could create a sense of awe and caution. At the tomb door, this silence reminded everyone that they were standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, something that required humility and respect. Stories of grave robbers punished by the gods circulated widely in Egypt. These tales reinforced the fear that to violate a tomb was not only a crime against the living family, but a sacrilege against Anubis himself. The desert was unforgiving, and robbers often disappeared without trace. Their fates were easy to interpret. The jackal god had caught them. Whether these deaths were natural misfortunes or not, the cultural memory attributed them to divine retribution. Anubis's role as guardian was not abstract. It had teeth, and yet the same figure who struck fear into thieves was invoked tenderly in prayers. Families asked him to protect their loved ones, to keep them safe, to ensure that no harm touched them in the afterlife. He was spoken to not as a distant terror, but as a trusted companion. His guardianship was fierce against enemies, but gentle toward those under his protection. This duality, merciless to violators, compassionate to mourners, made him a complete guardian, one who could not be bribed or swayed, one who fulfilled his role with absolute certainty. The tomb door itself became a symbol of his power. It was the line that divided the worlds. To step through it was to entrust oneself to his care, to acknowledge that beyond lay a reality where ordinary protections no longer applied. Only Anubis could make that passage safe. His presence at the door was a reminder that every life would one day come to this threshold. No matter how high or low, no matter how rich or poor, everyone would face the silent guardian. The Egyptians, who built with eternity in mind, understood that permanence required more than stone. It required divine protection. No wall was too thick, no lock too strong to stop decay, intrusion, or chaos without the presence of a god. Anubis was that god. His vigilance was eternal, his patience limitless. He did not tire, he did not falter, he did not sleep. He crouched forever at the threshold, a black figure against the silence of the tomb door, the eternal guardian who made death not only bearable, but secure. The desert gave Egypt its borders, but mythology gave those borders a face. For Anubis, the question of where he came from was never a simple matter of parents and lineage. The Egyptians were comfortable with multiple truths living side by side, each one reflecting a different temple's memory, a different city's pride, a different priesthood's need to explain why their god mattered most. In his earliest appearances, Anubis stands on his own, a complete figure whose authority comes from what he does rather than whose son he is. Later, when the Osirian story grows into the dominant plot of Egyptian religion, his birth is retold to bind him tightly to that new center. Depending on where you listen, he is the dutiful child of the righteous king, the secret offspring born from deception in the shadows, the desert's foundling raised by the river's most powerful queen, or a more ancient being whose origin is as old as the cemeteries he watches. These contradictions do not weaken him. They explain how a god of thresholds adapts to shifting truths without losing his place at the door. In the earliest royal funerary texts, Anubis appears without a family tree because he does not need one. Titles carry more weight than ancestry. He is called the Lord of the Sacred Land, the One upon his mountain, the Guardian of the Necropolis, the Master of the Embalming Place. Each epithet anchors him to a function. The Sacred Land is the desert cemetery beyond the fields. The mountain is the ridge that overlooks the tombs. The embalming place is the dark workshop where priests labor to preserve the dead. A god defined by thresholds is born of the threshold itself. In this form, he predates the full flowering of Osiris as ruler of the dead. He is not a prince within a royal family of gods, but the demanded presence at every burial. This independence explains why later generations felt compelled to weave him into a family story once Osiris became the axis of afterlife belief. A god so central could not be left outside the dynastic web forever. One version of his birth, the one most familiar in later retellings, places him directly in the heart of the Osirian drama. This story says that Nephthys, sister of Isis and wife of Set, desired Osiris. Disguising herself in the semblance of Isis, she lay with Osiris and conceived a child. Terrified of Set's wrath and ashamed of her deception, she abandoned the newborn in the marshes. Isis, finding the infant, took pity on him, raised him as her own, and thus the child became the loyal guardian of Osiris and Isis both. The narrative achieves several goals at once. It keeps Set removed from the making of a god who will later oppose him. It honors Isis as the universal mother who adopts what is cast aside. And it explains why Anubis is devoted to Osiris without being his rival. He owes his life to Isis's care, and he repays that debt by safeguarding the king's body when murder shatters the divine order. In a myth, where grief and restoration carry the weight of the world, a child found by the great mourner becomes the perfect servant of funerary rites. A harsher form of the tale preserves Nephthys' seduction and the abandonment, but changes the moral tone around the child. In this telling, he is a bastard born from confusion in the night, from a mistake that should have been hidden. The desert becomes his cradle because the desert is where society discards what it cannot integrate. Out of that exile emerges the God of all exiles, those cut off from the living by death. When the priests later dress in black and put on the long-eared mask to conduct embalmings, they reenact a story in which cast-off life is recovered and made sacred. A bastard by origin becomes a master of legitimacy in death, ensuring that every person, regardless of status, receives the full order of rights. The myth turns a stain into a credential. The one who knows abandonment refuses to abandon the dead. There were other lineages proposed by different centers of theology. Some traditions say he is the son of Ra, the great sun god whose daily voyage defines time itself. That version pushes Anubis back into a more primordial era, planting him in the earliest generation of divine beings who set the cosmos in motion. If he is Ra's child, then his authority comes not from the Osirian court, but from the architecture of the universe. The sun god empowers him to manage what the sun cannot touch, the world of darkness and the sealed tomb. In this reading, the regularity of funerary procedure mirrors the regularity of sunrise. The rites do not merely imitate an old story, they participate in the daily maintenance of order. Anubis, as son of Ra, becomes a technician of Ma'at, the principle of balance that holds heaven and earth together. A few voices make him the child of Set and Nephthys after all, a possibility that seems to contradict his role as Osiris's protector. Yet even that conflict can be turned into meaning. If the guardian of the tomb comes from the family of chaos, then the victory of order happens at the very threshold. A son of the desert learns to keep the desert from swallowing the dead. He is proof that even the raw materials of destruction can be bound to service. The Egyptians were not afraid of paradox. They built their theology from layered local truths rather than a single dogmatic source. A town that revered Set could still respect burial. A priesthood that honored Anubis could admit that origins were messy. The point was what the god accomplished, not how neatly the genealogy read. Regional cults sharpened these variations. Cities and nomes maintained their own canine deities long before centralized myth gave a uniform account. In one place, a wolfish opener of the way presided over processions. In another, a jackal lorded over hilltop cemeteries. Elsewhere, a jackal-faced guardian claimed the title foremost of the Western dead. Over time, these figures converged and borrowed from each other. A warrior guide who led royal banners into battle began to share traits with the funerary guide who led souls into judgment. A local jackal god of a dog city found his image and functions mirrored in another region's cult. What we call Anubis is a consolidation of canine powers into a single, more unified figure whose reliability cut across regions. This merging explains why genealogies multiply. Each cult center wove him into its chosen family, to Ra in one tradition, to Osiris in another, to independent primeval status in a third, to protect its local investment while agreeing on his job. The foundling motif, which presents him as discovered by Isis, is more than narrative decoration. It reveals how Egyptians understood social and divine kinship. Motherhood in their stories often extends beyond biology. Isis is not merely a birth mother, she is a creator of relationships. By nursing and naming, she claims the child and confers identity. The priesthood mirrors this work. When a body is delivered to the house of embalming, the dead are claimed by ritual, brought under Anubis's protection, and given a restored name through amulets and texts. Adoption, whether of a child or of a corpse into the care of rites, is an act that transforms the vulnerable into the guarded. The foundling becomes the emblem of what the funerary system does for everyone, rescues them from being lost. These birth stories also justified the roles of specialized clergy. If Anubis is associated with Osiris through adoption, then the embalmers, who wear his mask, serve not only the dead in general, but the body of the divine king in particular. Their work replays the most sacred episode of care in cosmic history. If he is linked to Ra, then their procedures contribute to cosmic maintenance, renewing order each time they wrap a limb or place a charm. If he is a child of Nephthys, the sister tied to boundary and twilight, then the workshop inherits the aura of the in-between, operating at the edge of day and night, city and desert, life and death. In every case, the tale of origin becomes a credential. The god's parentage authorizes the priest's tasks. There is a political dimension to these genealogies as well. When a cult rises, it tends to draw neighboring gods into its orbit. Osiris's ascendancy during the Middle Kingdom reshaped many relationships. A powerful funerary king required a staff. Gods who had been local managers of the dead became officials in his court. Some were retitled, some were married off, some were reborn as his cousins or sons. Anubis's shift from an independent chief of the necropolis to the trusted guide and embalmer of Osiris reflects this process. The new arrangement did not demote him, it refined his profile. He no longer had to rule an entire realm. He could focus on the most crucial transitions, guarding the body, preparing it, and guiding the soul. Myth made room for that focus by retelling his birth as a story of loyalty to the Osirian household. A foundling raised in the palace of grief has no higher calling than to ensure that grief is answered by restoration. The question of a father is less important than the certainty of a role, but the Egyptians still explored paternity to connect attributes. A father like Ra confers cosmic seniority and suggests that Anubis belongs to the original order of creation. A father like Osiris makes him a prince of funerary order, whose intimate knowledge of the king's death equips him to administer the dead. A father like Set introduces the possibility of taming and redirecting forces that otherwise threaten the tomb. Each choice brings a different shade to his character, but none of them changes his posture at the door. He remains the jackal who does not sleep. Language preserves his function more faithfully than any family tree. The names and titles attached to him in inscriptions return again and again to the same set of actions: guarding, embalming, leading, weighing, watching. The one in the place of embalming is a title that turns a room into a divine zone. The lord of the sacred land turns a cemetery into a jurisdiction. The opener of the ways attaches him to processions, both the processions of the living carrying a body to its tomb and the processions of the dead through the gates of the underworld. The focus never drifts far from work. Even when a hymn calls him beloved of a particular goddess or present in a specific city, the lines soon pivot back to what he does for the deceased. Later periods add further layers through cultural contact. When Greeks encounter Egyptian religion, they create syncretic figures that help them translate roles across pantheons. Anubis merges with Hermes in some circles, produced as Hermanubis, combining the Egyptian guide of the dead with the Greek psychopomp. This fusion does not answer the birth question, it extends it. Now he is imagined in a cosmopolitan family in which border crossing is the main constant. A god who already governed thresholds acquires a second passport. In Roman Egypt, where multiple traditions overlap, his image appears in new costumes while his core duties remain stable. The family keeps growing, but the job description does not change. If the myths of birth seem contradictory, they still cohere around a simple truth. Egypt needed a figure who could belong to every funeral, independent of the shifting fortunes of any single cult. Birth stories help knit the god into whatever theology is currently dominant, but they rarely remove older claims. A priest in a provincial town might still sing of him as Ra's child while acknowledging his service to Osiris in the annual rites. A family might cherish the tale of Isis's adoption while offering to him as the primeval guardian of their hilltop cemetery. Anubis accommodates them because his identity is not threatened by plural explanations. He is built for liminality. He can stand where two accounts overlap and do his work while theologians argue about which account is older. The bastard motif, provocative in its wording, also speaks to a moral stance within Egyptian thought. A child born in ambiguity and left outside the protections of the household has no entitlement but what is granted through care. The adopted infant owes everything to the one who lifts him from exposure. When that infant grows into the protector of the abandoned dead, the cycle closes. The society that rescued the vulnerable god receives protection in return. The myth insists that the least secure origins can produce the most reliable guardianship. In a land where desert and flood both threatened lives, that promise matter-of-factly fit experience. There is a human mirror to all of this in the people who carried out the rites. Embalmers and necropolis workers often belong to lineages of their own, with knowledge passed from parent to child through craft rather than blood alone. They lived near cemeteries, at the margins of ordinary neighborhoods, respected and feared for their closeness to death. To outsiders, they could seem suspect, touched by impurity, familiar with things that most people preferred not to see. Inside the system, they were indispensable. The story of an adopted child who becomes indispensable to the greatest gods dignifies their position. It tells every embalmer that the work which others avoid is the work that saves the community from chaos. The tug-of-war around paternity also reveals the Egyptian habit of letting function determine truth. Gods accrue relationships the way officials accrue portfolios. If a god takes on a task, myth grows to support that task. If a task moves to a different god, lineage shifts to explain why. Over centuries, these adjustments pile up like layers of paint. Strip them back, and you find the original wood. The jackal on the hill watching the graves, the black figure at the door, the silent presence in the workshop. The rest is connective tissue, valuable for understanding how communities thought, but never permitted to override the direct experience of death and the need for order. It is telling that the stories of his birth almost always find a way to bring Isis into view. Whether she is the wronged wife who becomes a mother to a child not her own, or the great magician who rebuilds what has been broken, her involvement signals that Anubis belongs to the domain of care. He is not a conqueror or a jealous guardian of status. He is a technician of compassion expressed through exact procedure. The adoption scene is the emotional blueprint. The embalming room is the practical blueprint. The myths connect them so closely that when a priest in a jackal mask leans over a body, the image of a divine woman cradling a rescued infant is never far behind. Care takes many forms: milk for a child, resin for a corpse. Both prevent disintegration. As the Assyrian narrative tightens around the land, the need to harmonize Anubis with it becomes more urgent. The most elegant solution is the one that makes him the first embalmer. If he is the child whom Isis raised, and the artisan who prepared Osiris's body, then he is bound to the royal story without being absorbed by it. He keeps his independence. The workshop remains his domain. The door remains his seat, while his actions become essential to the triumph of Osiris over decay. The myth of birth becomes a preface to the myth of craft. Having explained where he comes from, the tradition is ready to show what he does when the body of a god requires a guardian's hands. Whether he walks out of the marshes cradled by Isis, whether he stands up from the desert as the oldest of its watchers, whether he comes from the lineage of the sun or from a family that mistakes and violence have made complicated, the result is the same at the tomb. A black jackal waits where the stone meets the sand. He belongs to whoever needs him at that threshold. The dead do not ask for a genealogy, they ask for a guide. The living do not plead for a pedigree, they plead for a protector who will not turn away. The stories answer those requests by giving him every possible route into the household of gods so that no doorway can exclude him. The birth myths, then, are not an argument to be won. They are a set of keys, each cut to fit a different lock in Egypt's religious landscape. One unlocks Osiris's court, another opens the older sanctuaries of the cemeteries, a third fits the door of temples where the sun's schedules are the measure of truth. Anubis carries them all, because he alone must move through every door. Once he is inside, the work begins, the work that will define him more than any parentage can. The wrapping of limbs, the sealing of jars, the placement of amulets, the recitation of words that teach a soul to remember its name. These acts will be said to come from him first, and every embalmer will repeat them as a faithful copy of the craft he established.
The murder of Osiris was not just a family tragedy, it was the event that shook the foundation of the Egyptian universe. Set, his jealous brother, dismembered the king's body and scattered the pieces across the land, leaving only ruin behind. Death in that moment was not the ordinary passage every human faced, but total annihilation. A divine king had been reduced to fragments, denied burial, denied wholeness, denied the chance of rebirth. For Egyptians, whose entire culture rested on the belief that preservation opened the door to eternity, this was the nightmare at the heart of existence. If even Osiris could be undone, then what hope did any soul have? It is at this moment that Anubis enters the story not as a watchful guardian or impartial judge, but as an artisan, the first craftsman of eternity. The myth says that when Isis searched the land and gathered her husband's scattered limbs, it was Anubis who came to her aid. She may have been the mourner and magician, but it was he who knew how to work with the broken body. He cleansed it, anointed it, bound it, and wrapped it until the scattered corpse became a whole again. What Set had undone, Anubis reassembled. What chaos had scattered, he ordered. In that act, embalming was born. The Egyptians would later say that every ritual performed in the embalming tent was a direct imitation of this first act. The oils used, the resins, the linen bandages, the spells recited, the masks worn, none of it was invented by mortals. It was received from Anubis, who learned how to preserve a god and passed that knowledge to humanity. In the myth, Osiris is restored to such perfection that he can rise again, not in the land of the living, but as king of the dead. That restoration is more than personal. It reshapes the cosmic order. Death, which had been absolute, becomes reversible through ritual. From that moment forward, no human death is final if the body is given into the hands of Anubis. The embalming itself was a sacred drama staged in a space known as the Per-Nefer, the House of Beauty. From the outside, it looked like a tent or a workshop, but to Egyptians it was a theatre where divine precedent was reenacted. Priests wearing jackal masks became living embodiments of Anubis. Their hands were his hands, their voices his voice. They did not claim to be mere servants. They claimed to channel the god himself, repeating the motions he first performed on Osiris. Each body laid out on the embalming table was treated as if it too were a murdered king waiting to be made whole. The process was long, lasting 70 days, a number that echoed the journey of the stars across the night sky. During this time, the body was washed, dried, packed with natron salts, and wrapped in layer upon layer of linen. Each stage was marked by prayers and rituals, the removal of the organs, the placement of canopic jars, the sealing of the mouth, the careful wrapping of each limb. Every act had a mythical precedent.
It was not enough to preserve flesh. The procedure reenacted the myth of Osiris so that every dead person could share in his rebirth. Anubis was there in every gesture, the silent overseer ensuring that the imitation was faithful. The texts make clear that the priests understood themselves as actors in this first drama. Instructions often say, "Do as Anubis did for Osiris." The god was not a distant patron. He was present in the tent, inhabiting the masks, guiding the hands, watching the work. The act of embalming was thus a collaboration between mortals and a god. Families entrusted their loved ones not to human skill alone, but to the divine craftsman who had saved Osiris. The presence of Anubis guaranteed that the work was not merely technical, but sacred. The myth of the first embalming also explains why Anubis is so closely tied to Isis. She is the mourner who gathers the body and weeps over it, while he is the artisan who preserves it. Together they form the two halves of funerary ritual, emotion and technique, grief and craft, devotion and preservation. Without Isis, the body would never be found. Without Anubis, it would never be restored. Their cooperation is what makes resurrection possible. For Egyptians, every funeral repeated this union. Women wailed as professional mourners to embody Isis's grief, while priests in jackal masks worked in silence to embody Anubis's skill. The myth had become liturgy, and liturgy kept the myth alive. Embalming was not only about preserving appearance, it was about preserving identity. The body was seen as the anchor of the soul. If it decayed, the soul could become lost, unable to recognize itself in the afterlife. Anubis, by embalming Osiris, ensured that the god retained his wholeness and his name. The process of wrapping was a way of binding identity to form, of making sure that the person remained who they were, even beyond death. Each amulet placed among the wrappings had a specific role: to guard the heart, to seal the throat, to preserve the limbs. The entire body became a fortress of linen and magic, a work of art dedicated to permanence. Anubis's association with resin, natron, and linen was so strong that these materials were thought to be sacred in themselves. Natron was not just salt, it was a divine substance that dried away corruption. Resins were not just perfumes, they were the very tears of the gods solidified into matter. Linen was not just cloth, it was the skin of purity, grown from flax under the sun. When these substances were applied by priests in the name of Anubis, they became tools of transformation. A corpse was not being treated as a piece of decaying flesh. It was being initiated into a new form of being. The myth of the first embalming also reframed the relationship between life and death. Before, death could be imagined as final. After Osiris and Anubis, death became a phase, a stage of transition. Embalming was the bridge. It gave the dead time to move from one state to another, from corruption to preservation, from mortality to immortality. The 70 days of the ritual mirrored this transformation, just as the body slowly changed, drying, shrinking, and being remade in linen. The soul made its way through the dangerous corridors of the underworld. When the wrappings were finished, the body was ready, and so too was the spirit. The practical details of embalming reinforced the myth. The incision made on the side of the body to remove the organs was a violent act, but it was followed by healing rituals, spells that apologized to the body and restored its integrity. The jackal god oversaw this balance. Violence was permitted only if it was followed by restoration. To cut was to heal, to remove was to preserve. In this way, embalming itself became a microcosm of Osiris's death and restoration. The body was cut just as Osiris was dismembered, but it was healed just as Anubis restored him. Every Egyptian underwent this miniature version of the great myth. It is important to recognize how radical this transformation was. Many cultures feared death and disposed of bodies quickly to avoid contamination. The Egyptians embraced the body, touched it, worked with it, preserved it. They did not hide from decay, but confronted it directly, turning it into a moment of sacred action. This courage came from their trust in Anubis.
He had gone first. He had taken a god's corpse in his hands. and he had succeeded. If he could preserve Osiris, then surely he could preserve them. Death was not terrifying when placed under his supervision. It was orderly, manageable, even beautiful. The presence of Anubis also sanctified the embalmers themselves. These were not ordinary workers. They belonged to a liminal profession, feared by some because of their intimacy with corpses, but revered because of their divine connection. They lived near cemeteries apart from ordinary settlements in a community bound by specialized knowledge. They performed their craft with secrecy, for the mysteries of embalming were not for common eyes. What they did as extensions of Anubis. When they touched a body, they were continuing the first embalming. This identification with the god gave them authority and dignity. They were human, but their hands carried divine skill. The myth also explains why Anubis was trusted as the weigher of the heart. He had proven himself impartial. In embalming Osiris, he had not sought power for himself. He had acted as a servant of order, restoring what had been broken, ensuring continuity. A god who could be trusted with the body of a murdered king could be trusted with the fate of ordinary souls. His loyalty was not to a single family, but to the principle that death required care. This impartiality made him incorruptible in judgment. He had proven his devotion not in words but in action, in the act of wrapping and restoring. The myth of the first embalming grew into art. Tomb walls depicted Anubis bending over the mummy, his black body sleek, his jackal head solemn. Sometimes he is shown standing behind the bier, his hands resting gently on the corpse as if blessing it. Sometimes he is shown with Isis and Nephthys at either end, the three figures encircling the dead in protection. These images were not illustrations of myth but reenactments. By painting them on the tomb wall, families invited the god to repeat the act in perpetuity. The dead person inside the tomb was never without his touch. In time, this myth shaped Egyptian identity itself. To be Egyptian was to believe that death did not erase you, that with proper rites you could endure forever. Anubis was the guarantor of that belief. Without him, the body would rot, the soul would wander, and memory would dissolve. With him, death was only a change of state. His craft defined what it meant to die as an Egyptian. It was not merely a biological event, but a ritual transformation overseen by the god who had once preserved the greatest king. Every person, no matter their status, became a participant in the drama of Osiris, with Anubis as their artisan and guardian. The myth also carried a subtle warning. Just as Osiris was restored only because Isis gathered the pieces and Anubis embalmed them, so too could ordinary people only endure if their families and communities performed the rites. To be denied embalming was to be denied eternity. Anubis was impartial, but his presence required action. The dead needed to be given into his care through ritual. This responsibility bound families to one another. No one wanted their loved ones to be abandoned. No one wanted to be abandoned themselves. The myth of the first embalming thus reinforced social cohesion. It was not just a divine story, but a communal obligation. What Set had intended as an act of finality became, through Anubis, the foundation of immortality. By embalming Osiris, Anubis showed that death could be reversed, that the body could be remade, that the soul could continue. His craft was not only the salvation of a god, but the gift of eternity to all humanity. Each mummy resting in a tomb, wrapped in linen and sealed with prayers, was a testimony to that first embalming. Every jar of resin, every amulet placed among the bandages, every priest who donned the jackal mask, all of it traced back to the moment when a god knelt beside a broken corpse and made it whole again. The myth ends not with Osiris's return to the land of the living, but with his enthronement in the underworld. That is the final lesson of Anubis's craft. Embalming does not restore life as it was. It prepares for a different kind of life. The preserved body becomes a vessel for eternity, not for ordinary days, but for everlasting presence.
Anubis's art is not resurrection in the simple sense, but transformation into a new state of being. By embalming Osiris, he did not bring back a king, he made a god of the dead. And by embalming every human body, he made it possible for mortals to share in that god's eternity. At the heart of Egyptian religion lies this paradox. Death is inevitable, yet death is not the end. The bridge between these truths is embalming, and the master of embalming is Anubis. From the first moment he touched the body of Osiris, he became more than a jackal god. He became the artisan of immortality, the silent craftsman who works at the edge of life, preserving what would otherwise decay, ensuring that order triumphs over chaos. To the Egyptians, no myth was more essential, no gift more profound. The image of Anubis is one of the most recognizable in all of Egyptian mythology. A man's body crowned with the head of a jackal. It is sleek, narrow, long-muzzled, ears pricked to attention, eyes alert and watchful. For thousands of years, this form has been stamped on amulets, painted on tomb walls and carved into statues that crouch before the dead. But why a jackal? Why did the Egyptians choose this animal, of all creatures in their world, to embody the god who guarded their passage into eternity? To answer that question, we have to look not only at the animal itself, but at how the Egyptians saw it, how it behaved on the edge of their lives, and how its presence in the desert shaped their imagination of death. The jackal was not a domesticated companion. It was not a loyal partner like a dog in later cultures. It was a scavenger. To Egyptians who lived near necropolises carved into desert cliffs or shallow graves dug into the sand, the sight of jackals was common. At dusk, they prowled the boundaries of villages. At night, their howls echoed across the landscape. They dug into fresh burials, dragging bones and corpses into the open. They thrived on carrion, unafraid of decay. This behavior made them figures of fear and disgust to ordinary eyes. And yet, precisely because they haunted the cemeteries, the Egyptians came to see them as guardians of those same spaces. They were drawn to the paradox. The animal that threatened the body was the very one best equipped to protect it if transfigured into a god. To take an animal associated with danger and make it sacred was not unusual in Egypt. The crocodile was worshipped as Sobek, the falcon as Horus, the cow as Hathor. Each case reflected not only admiration, but fear. The Egyptians understood that what was powerful in nature had to be acknowledged, honored, and bound to the divine order. To ignore or destroy it was impossible. So they did what their religious imagination excelled at. They transformed it. They took the scavenger and made it a sentinel. They took the desecrator and made it the preserver. By giving the jackal a divine mask, they turned it from threat to guardian. The color black intensified the symbolism. Jackals themselves were sandy brown or grey, but Anubis was almost always shown with black fur. The choice was deliberate. Black was the color of decay, the shade of corpses dried and darkened in the desert air. But it was also the color of fertile soil, the rich silt left by the Nile's flood. To paint Anubis black was to show him as the union of these two meanings, death and rebirth, corruption and fertility. He was the animal who prowled the cemeteries, but also the divine power who guaranteed that death led not to annihilation, but to renewal. The jackal's face became more than an animal feature. It became a cosmic emblem. The Egyptians were also attentive observers of behavior. Jackals moved with silence and cunning. They survived in the harshest environments, enduring where other animals faltered. Their ability to appear suddenly, to vanish into the dunes, to follow human settlements without ever belonging to them, made them liminal creatures. They existed at the boundary between wild and domestic, between predator and scavenger. Anubis inherited this liminality. He was never fully of the living or of the dead. He moved between worlds as easily as the jackal moved between village and desert. The face of the jackal was the perfect mask for a god, whose power depended on standing at thresholds, there is also a deeper symbolic layer. In many Egyptian texts, Anubis is called the opener of the ways. Some scholars believe this title may originally have referred to a wolfish deity from Upper Egypt, but in time it was merged with Anubis's jackal form. The phrase fits the jackal perfectly. In the desert, jackals are often the first to find paths through dunes and wastelands, leading the way for other animals. For the Egyptians, this behavior became a metaphor for what Anubis did for souls. He opened the way through the dangerous terrain of the afterlife, guiding the dead along paths only he could see. The jackal's face, always alert and searching, embodied this guiding role. The Egyptians were not naive about the jackal's destructive side. They knew that scavengers could desecrate the very graves they held sacred, but instead of seeing this as contradiction, they folded it into their theology. The jackal became a symbol of both danger and protection. To ignore the animal's power was to leave the dead vulnerable. To adopt it into divine imagery was to control it, to make it serve order rather than chaos. Anubis, therefore, is not a sanitized version of the jackal. He is the jackal transfigured, still carrying its associations with death and decay, but elevated to the role of guardian. This choice also reflects the Egyptian worldview more broadly. For them, the natural world was not something to be separated from religion. Animals were not just background. They were embodiments of forces that touched human life every day. To see jackals at the edge of cemeteries was to encounter the divine directly. Religion did not abstract the animal away, it intensified its meaning. Anubis was not just a symbol. To Egyptians, he was present wherever jackals prowled. Their cries at night were his voice, their movements across the desert his vigilance. The animal was both itself and more than itself. The jackal face also gave Anubis a distinct character among the gods. While many deities were shown in animal-headed form, few carried the same combination of fear and trust. Horus the falcon was a warrior king, Ra, the sun falcon, a radiant creator. Sobek, the crocodile, was dangerous, but also tied to fertility and the Nile. The jackal alone was bound so tightly to death. His face meant burial, embalming, cemeteries, tombs. To see his likeness was to be reminded of mortality, and yet it was not a terrifying reminder. Unlike demons or monsters, Anubis's jackal head was sleek, calm, dignified. It did not snarl or threaten, it watched, it waited, it assured. That distinction gave him a quiet authority that no other god possessed. We can see how carefully the Egyptians crafted this image in their funerary art. Anubis is often shown bending over the bier of the dead, his jackal head solemn, his hands steady as he touches the body. Sometimes he is shown crouching on top of a shrine, his sleek form stretched along its surface like a living guardian. In all cases, his posture is controlled, never wild or frenzied. The jackal face is there, but it is dignified. The Egyptians took the animal's associations with scavenging and reshaped them into symbols of care and watchfulness. The result is an image that carries both realism and transformation. It is recognizably a jackal, but it is a jackal transfigured into a god who preserves rather than devours. There is an irony here worth noting. The Egyptians gave Anubis the jackal's face precisely because of their fear of jackals desecrating graves. In elevating the animal to divine status, they ensured that it became the protector rather than the destroyer. By venerating the jackal in religious form, they sanctified cemeteries, surrounding them with divine guardianship. The fear of grave-robbing animals thus gave rise to one of the most enduring and reassuring images in human history, the jackal-headed god who protects the dead forever. Fear was transformed into comfort, danger into guardianship. Over time, the jackal face also became a mask for human priests. During embalming rituals, a priest would wear a headpiece shaped like a jackal's head, taking on the role of Anubis himself. This practice reinforced the identification of god and animal. The jackal was not just an emblem, it was a channel through which the god's presence entered the ritual. To see a priest in the mask was to see Anubis in flesh, repeating the first embalming, protecting the body, ensuring the transition into the afterlife. The mask was not a disguise, it was an incarnation. The choice of jackal also speaks to Egypt's relationship with the desert. The Nile was life, but the desert was death. Jackals belonged to the desert, prowling its edges, surviving its barrenness. To make the jackal's face divine was to claim that even the desert itself could be tamed, that its chaos could be turned into order. Anubis's face was thus a sign that no realm, however dangerous, lay outside the reach of divine order. Even in the wilderness there was guardianship. Even in decay there was preservation. When Greeks and Romans later encountered Anubis, they often misunderstood the jackal face, sometimes calling him a dog-headed god. To them, the image seemed strange, alien, even monstrous. But for Egyptians, it was not monstrous at all. It was familiar, deeply grounded in daily experience. They did not see a grotesque hybrid, but a natural embodiment of truth. The jackal face was not an invention, it was recognition. They had seen it in the desert for centuries. They knew its habits, its dangers, its cries. They had lived with it. To give it divine form was to admit that it had always been part of their world, shaping their imagination of death. The question of why the jackal was chosen, then, has many layers. It was chosen because jackals haunted cemeteries. It was chosen because they embodied liminality. It was chosen because their blackness could symbolize both decay and fertility. It was chosen because fear of them demanded transformation. It was chosen because their behavior mirrored the role Anubis played as opener of the way. All these reasons converge in the sleek black jackal face that has endured for millennia. To look at the face of Anubis is to see a paradox resolved. It is to see an animal feared as a desecrator transformed into the eternal guardian. It is to see death itself acknowledged but not surrendered to, shaped instead into something that promises continuity. The jackal's face is not a mask of terror but a mask of assurance. It says that the wild scavenger at the edge of the desert has been tamed, that his power has been claimed for order, that death itself has been bound into ritual. It is the perfect image for a god who is not the ruler of the underworld but its guardian, not the king of the dead, but the one who ensures that the dead reach their king safely. Every Egyptian who saw that face knew what it meant. It meant that no grave was left unguarded, no body left unattended, no soul left without guidance. It meant that the jackal of the desert, feared for its desecration, had become the silent watchman of eternity. It meant that death, however frightening, had a guardian with a face as familiar as the animals that prowled the night. The jackal's face was more than a symbol, it was a promise. To walk among the necropolises of ancient Egypt was to walk in a city of silence. Stretching for miles along the desert's edge, these fields of tombs were more than resting places for the dead. They were landscapes of memory, carefully constructed, filled with offerings, lined with chapels, and guarded by gods. At the center of this landscape stood one figure above all others, Anubis. He was not only the embalmer or the guide of souls, but the master of these vast cemeteries, the lord of sacred ground, the one who held authority over every tomb and every spirit that wandered between them. The Egyptians called him Khentiamentiu, meaning foremost of the Westerners. The title alone reveals his dominion. To be a Westerner was to be dead, for the sun set in the west and carried with it all human life into the unseen world. The cemeteries were called the West, regardless of their geographic position. To rule over the Westerners was to rule over the dead, and Anubis was their foremost, their leader, their shepherd. This title did not place him in a throne room of the underworld, but in the desert hills above the tombs, a jackal-shaped silhouette watching from the ridges, master of the landscape itself. Cemeteries in Egypt were not hidden away. They were prominent, monumental, designed to impress. The pyramids of Giza, the sprawling mastabas of Saqqara, the cliff-cut tombs of Thebes, these were not quiet corners. They were entire cities of stone. Families visited them with offerings. Festivals were held among them. Priests worked within them daily. Life and death were woven together in constant interaction. And through it all, Anubis presided. His statue stood at entrances. His name was carved in prayers. His form was painted on walls. The dead belonged to him, and so did the places where they were buried. But Anubis's role as lord of cemeteries went beyond architecture. It extended to the restless spirits themselves. Not every dead person rested easily. Some, burdened with guilt or denied proper rites, lingered as akhu, wandering spirits who might trouble the living. To Egyptians, the afterlife was not automatic. It required order, embalming, offerings, spells. Without these, the soul might wander between worlds, restless and dangerous. Anubis was the one who kept these spirits in check. He was invoked to bind them, to restrain them, to ensure that the wandering dead did not become threats to the living. His authority extended not just to tombs of stone, but to the very souls that drifted in uncertainty. Texts and spells frequently call on him to guard against malevolent spirits. Just as he watched over the corpse to ensure it did not decay, he watched over the soul to ensure it did not stray. If the proper rites were performed, the spirit joined the great procession of the Westerners, safely guided into the care of Osiris. If they were neglected, Anubis was the one who intervened, preventing them from disrupting the balance of the world. He was the god who kept cemeteries peaceful, not only by protecting tombs from physical violation, but by keeping the spiritual order intact. The image of Anubis crouched on tomb shrines captures this dual guardianship perfectly. His sleek black form not only warded off intruders, but also reassured the family that their loved one's spirit would not wander aimlessly. The cemeteries were places of great vulnerability. Wealth was buried with the dead, inviting robbers. Bodies were fragile, inviting decay. Spirits were restless, inviting disruption. In each case, Anubis was the one who guaranteed stability. He was the glue that held together the fragile balance between life and death. The Egyptians also tied him closely to the cult of remembrance. Cemeteries were not meant to be forgotten spaces. They were places where offerings were brought, festivals of the dead celebrated, prayers recited. Anubis presided over these acts as well. He was invoked to carry offerings to the deceased, to make sure that food and drink reached them in the afterlife. Families prayed to him directly, asking that their gifts not be wasted, that the spirits of their ancestors receive the sustenance they needed. He was the channel of continuity between generations. Without him, remembrance could falter, and the dead could fade into neglect. With him, memory was eternal. One of his epithets was Lord of the Sacred Land. The Sacred Land was not a mythical heaven, but the actual ground of the necropolis, the desert slopes where tombs clustered. To call him Lord of this land was to recognize his authority over geography itself. The desert was not empty. It was claimed, sanctified, organized under his gaze. When Egyptians looked at the cliffs of Abydos or the ridges of Saqqara, they did not see barren wasteland. They saw Anubis's domain, guarded and holy. To step into these landscapes was to step into his presence. And yet, his dominion was not only territorial, it was moral. Cemeteries were where social order was reinforced. The rich were buried with elaborate goods, the poor with modest ones, but all relied on Anubis for protection. He was the great equalizer. In life, status separated people. In death, everyone lay under his authority. Kings and farmers alike needed him. No pyramid, however massive, could do without his guardianship. No simple grave, however shallow, was beneath his care. His impartiality in cemeteries mirrored his impartiality in judgment. The dead were all his Westerners, equal under his gaze. The presence of Anubis in cemeteries also shaped Egyptian psychology. To live near a necropolis was not frightening, it was reassuring. Families knew that their loved ones were guarded. The sight of jackals on the ridges was not simply a reminder of decay, it was a sign of the god watching. The cemeteries were not places of horror, but of continuity, woven into the rhythm of life. Anubis made that possible. By mastering cemeteries, he normalized death, turning it into an ordered part of existence rather than a chaotic interruption. The wandering spirits he controlled reflected this same balance. Egyptians did not deny the possibility of ghosts. They acknowledged that the dead could return in dreams, could cause illness, could disrupt. But instead of fearing them blindly, they invoked Anubis to manage them. He was the one who ensured that spirits did not overstep, that the boundary between living and dead held firm. In this way, he became not only the god of the dead, but the god of boundaries. He made cemeteries safe for the living as well as for the dead. Festivals of the dead reveal his centrality. During these events, families would gather at tombs, bring food, light lamps, and celebrate their ancestors. The presence of the dead was not abstract. It was felt, invoked, honored. Anubis presided over these gatherings, ensuring that the communication between worlds was orderly. He was the master of the liminal space where living and dead met. His authority was what made such festivals possible, preventing the encounter from dissolving into fear or chaos. Archaeological finds confirm his presence everywhere in cemeteries. Amulets bearing his form are among the most common funerary artifacts. They were placed on the body to ensure protection, buried in tombs to guard them, carried by mourners as tokens of his blessing. His image is ubiquitous in funerary papyri painted on coffins, carved into stelae. This constant presence reflects how essential he was to the cemetery's order. To bury without invoking him was unthinkable. The Egyptians also imagined him as a psychopomp, guiding souls not only within the necropolis, but beyond it. Cemeteries were thresholds. From them, the soul embarked on its journey through the underworld. Anubis ensured that the departure was safe, that the soul did not wander lost before it even began. His dominion over cemeteries was thus inseparable from his role as guide. He did not just guard the dead where they lay, he opened the way for them to move forward. It is significant that even after Osiris rose to prominence as the great ruler of the underworld, Anubis retained his title as Lord of Cemeteries. His role could not be absorbed because it was too practical, too immediate, too grounded in everyday ritual. Osiris reigned as king, but Anubis worked at the threshold. Kingship could be imagined in myth, but cemeteries required guardianship every day. Families continued to call on him, embalmers continued to wear his mask, priests continued to invoke his authority. He remained indispensable. The title, Foremost of the Westerners, also carried a symbolic dimension. To lead the dead was not only to guard them, but to guide them. Anubis was imagined at the head of great processions of souls, moving westward across the desert, toward the horizon where the sun disappeared. He was their shepherd, their general, their pathfinder. His authority was not limited to a single tomb, but extended to the entire community of the dead. Every person buried in Egypt was under his leadership. The necropolis was his kingdom, vast, silent, and eternal. To the Egyptians, this was not a grim thought. It was reassuring to know that no one was lost, that no matter how many had died, all were gathered under the same guardian. The cemeteries were vast, but they were not chaotic. They were ordered by Anubis, filled with his vigilance. His mastery over cemeteries and wandering spirits gave meaning to the Egyptian vision of death. Without him, the tombs would be vulnerable, the spirits restless, the boundary unstable. With him, the dead were protected, the spirits guided, the cemeteries sacred. The lordship of Anubis over cemeteries was not about domination but about care. He did not rule as a tyrant but as a sentinel. His power was exercised in silence, in vigilance, in impartiality. He belonged not to the living or the dead alone, but to the threshold where they met. Every cemetery, every tomb, every wandering spirit was his domain. And in that dominion, he gave Egypt one of its greatest assurances, that death was not abandonment, that cemeteries were not chaotic wastelands, that the dead were not forgotten.
They were all gathered under the watch of the jackal god, the silent lord of cemeteries and wandering spirits.
The Hall of Judgment was pictured as a place of order rather than spectacle. Walls carried lists of laws, gods sat in rows like officials in a court, and at the center stood a scale. That scale was the focus of everything that followed a life. The Egyptians gave it a plain method: weigh the heart against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart balanced with truth, the journey continued. If it did not, the path ended. It was not a mystery play, it was a procedure, and the figure who controlled that procedure was the same one who had guarded the tomb door and overseen the rites at the embalming table. Anubis did not sit on a throne in this room, and he did not deliver speeches. He stood by the apparatus, checked the pointer, adjusted the tongue of the balance, and kept the process clean. Images from funerary papyri show the layout clearly. The deceased is led in by a god with a jackal's head. Anubis grips the hand and brings the soul to the scale, then moves to the device itself. One pan holds the heart, Ib, the organ the Egyptians treated as the seat of character, memory, intention, and conscience. The other pan carries a single ostrich feather, the sign of Ma'at, the principle of truth and right order that keeps the cosmos stable. The pointer at the top must rest exactly at center. No tilt is tolerated. Nearby stands Thoth, the scribe of the gods, ready to record the result. At the base of the scale crouches Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, waiting to devour any heart that proves heavy with wrongdoing. Osiris presides at a distance as the ruler of the tribunal, flanked by Isis and Nephthys, and by the assessors who uphold the law. In every piece of this scene, Anubis remains the operative force. He is the one who makes the test function. To call him a judge would miss the way Egyptians thought about responsibility in this moment. The judgment is real, the stakes absolute, but Anubis is not the one who decides guilt or innocence. He is the one who ensures that deciding becomes possible. He prevents interference. He ensures the accuracy of the balance. He confirms that the heart being weighed belongs to the person on trial. Legends even suggest that he protects against attempts to tamper with the result, whether by demons eager to claim a soul or by the soul's own heart turning against its owner. What he administers is procedure, and in Egyptian thought, procedure is sacred. Without it, justice collapses into noise. The focus on the heart explains why the weighing mattered so much. Unlike later cultures that would place thought in the brain, Egyptians treated the heart as the core of identity. It remembered, it felt, it testified. When a person died, the rest of the body could be removed, dried, wrapped, and even set aside in jars. But the heart stayed in place. It anchored the person to themselves. This is why families placed a heart scarab over the chest, engraved with words from funerary spells that asked the heart not to betray its owner. The plea sounds simple: do not stand as a witness against me, but it reveals a concrete fear. The heart knows everything. If it speaks freely, the truth, good or bad, will be told. The negative confession, recited before the 42 assessors, makes the moral code explicit. The deceased denies crimes one by one. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not caused pain. I have not tampered with weights. I have not cheated in the fields. I have not polluted the river. I have not blocked water in its season. I have not starved cattle. I have not taken food from the children. I have not lied in court. The list is not abstract. It touches daily life. commerce, agriculture, law, family, neighbors. The afterlife demanded fairness that matched the fairness expected of a market scale or an irrigation gate. The standard is ma'at, and ma'at is practical. It is the harvest brought in on time and measured honestly. It is a judge who cannot be bought. It is a boat that arrives when the river is safe to cross. Anubis's role beside the balance becomes a natural extension of this worldview. He does not moralize, he calibrates. Art handles this calibration with small details. In many scenes, Anubis bends toward the scale, one hand on each pan chain, eyes on the indicator. He is not grand, he is exact. If a jackal god can be an engineer, this is the moment. He examines the tongue of the balance so that no dust or nudge can falsify the reading. He keeps Amit at the base from acting before the reading is final. He turns his head toward Thoth so the record will match the instrument. He has already done the same work for centuries at every tomb door. Keep order steady. The job has not changed, the room has. Because the heart is the witness, the scene also depends on protective measures that come from Anubis's other domains. The heart scarab's inscription is one. The careful preservation of the body, which keeps the heart in place during the ritual, is another. The presence of Ma'at's feather in the opposite pan is a third. None of these elements are improvisations. They are standard equipment in a system where the god of embalming, the god of thresholds, and the god of the scale are the same figure working at different stations. Egyptians did not imagine the afterlife as a surprise test. They prepared for it the way they prepared for a harvest, with tools, schedules, and rules. A question often arises in modern retellings: is Anubis the judge here, or the guide? The answer inside Egyptian procedure is simple. He is the guide who handles the instrument. He brings the soul to the doorway, then shifts roles and becomes the officer of the court who makes sure the doorway functions. Judgment belongs to the measure itself, Ma'at, and to the assembly who accepts that measure. Osiris embodies the settled order that receives the worthy. Thoth represents accurate record. Amit enforces the consequence for failure. Anubis ties them together. Remove him, and you do not get a stricter judge, you get a broken machine. This makes his impartiality more than a virtue. It is the keystone. In a world where wealth and rank mattered in life, the weighing of the heart offered a moment where rank could do nothing. A king's heart and a farmer's heart met the same feather. Anubis, who served both in the embalming room and in the poorest desert burials, enforces this equality. He cannot be bribed because there is nothing to buy. The scale will settle where it must. It is common to call this justice, but the Egyptian thought behind it is closer to maintenance. The universe runs on Ma'at. People either contribute to that stability or they do not. The scale checks input against output. This contributes to a clearer view of Amit as well. The devourer does not hunt innocence. She does not lurk in the world to take people by accident. She appears only when the reading is final, and only to perform one task: remove from circulation a person whose imbalance would damage the order if allowed to continue. It is a harsh remedy, but in the room it is a contained one. Anubis ensures that she acts only when permitted. If a heart is light, Amit waits. If it is heavy, she works. He is not her master in the sense of commanding her appetite. He is her controller in the sense of when a penalty may be applied. The structure of the hall underscores this control. The place is often called the Hall of Two Truths. The phrase seems strange until you watch the scene. There is the truth of what the person says, I have not done this, I have not done that, and the truth of what the heart weighs. Words and weight must match. Where they do, the reading is clear. Where they do not, the reading is also clear. Anubis stands between these truths, making sure the comparison isn't fogged by interference. The engineering image returns, the instrument takes in a claim, and outputs a result. Thoth writes the output. Osiris accepts or rejects the person based on that output. The balance of the room mirrors the balance of society. Claims checked, measures read, records filed. A further detail brings his work into everyday life. Among the "I have not" statements is one that denies tampering with weights and measures. The same standard used in a market stall is applied at the scale of the dead. Cheating on a balance in life was a violation of Ma'at. The final balance now checks whether a person lived by that rule. Anubis makes sure the rule is not abused even now. He will not allow an over-heavy feather or a trick pan. He is not the owner of the law, he is the technician who assures its application is exact. The heart scarab spell, which asks the heart not to stand against its owner, can sound like a plea to cheat. It is not. It recognizes that memory can be harsh, that shame may exaggerate, that a heart might seize on a single failure and sink itself with it. The spell asks for a fair reading, not for an erasure of fact. "Do not make my name stink before the gods," it says in some versions. Anubis's presence guarantees that the fair in that request is what Ma'at defines, not what fear wishes. The scarab and the scale are not enemies. They are paired safeguards against distortion from panic or malice. In many artworks, after the weighing is done and the result is favorable, Anubis resumes his earlier role and leads the deceased forward again, now past the scale and toward Osiris. He does not linger to bask in success. He escorts the soul onward, as if to say that the test was never an end in itself. It was a checkpoint. The destination is the field of reeds, the well-ordered land where the righteous farm and feast without exhaustion or hunger. There the person joins a community that reflects the best parts of life without the failures. Anubis's work brought them to the gate and saw them through it. Now another order receives them. The presence of bystander figures in the weighing scenes, fate, fortune, the birth goddess, complicates the picture without changing Anubis's job. These deities mark that a person's life contains givens and chances as well as choices. The weighing accounts for all of it because the heart is the sum of the life lived under those conditions. If a god set the day of birth, if luck favored or opposed, if circumstances made certain tasks harder, the heart's record includes the responses to those realities. Anubis does not remove context, but he does remove excuses disguised as tampering. The feather remains the feather. Because the weighing is public, gods watch, records are kept. The process also carries a social message for the living. What you do when no one is looking will be seen. What you take from a neighbor's field, how you lie in a dispute, how you treat a stranger at your door, all of it adds weight. The message does not require sermons. The image of the scale in Tumart says enough. Families saw it when they prepared the body. Priests saw it whenever they read from funerary papyri. Embalmers worked under it as an implied standard. Keep your charges safe. Do not cut corners. Do not cheat with resin and linen. Anubis watched them too. A god who checks pan chains in the next world does not tolerate sloppy hands in this one. The consistency of his role across texts is striking. Whether the papyrus comes from a grand burial or a modest one, whether the art is fine or simple, whether the names of lesser gods shift with region and era, Anubis stands in the same position. He touches the balance. He brings the person in. He keeps the devourer at bay until the reading is done. He hands the soul forward if the measure is good. Stability of image reflects stability of function. Egyptians could accept multiple birth stories for him. They could place him in different genealogies, but they did not permit ambiguity about the scale. There is a temptation in modern accounts to elevate Osiris as the judge and reduce Anubis to a porter. The art does not support that reduction. Osiris sanctions, Anubis operationalizes. Without a clean instrument, a sanction is theatre. This is why embalmers wore his mask even when the ritual had nothing to do with scales. They represented the person who makes process work. A culture that built canals, measured flood levels, and scheduled labor by seasons understood the dignity of such work. The jackal god is the custodian of the workflow between death and admission. This practical framing also clarifies why fear subsides when Anubis is present. The afterlife is dangerous because it contains unknowns. The weighing removes one set of unknowns by telling the person exactly how they will be assessed. The presence of a god who will not allow tampering removes another. Anxiety is replaced by preparation. Live by Ma'at, repair what you can while alive, and enter the room with your heart as light as truth permits. The god at the scale is the guarantee that preparation matters. In a few scenes, when a reading goes poorly, Anubis is shown restraining the condemned from bolting or pleading past the result. He is not cruel, he is firm. The test is not a negotiation. The discipline protects the value of passing. If failure could be evaded, success would mean nothing. The devourer's presence would become a bluff. By keeping the line, Anubis preserves meaning for everyone who lived within Ma'at's limits. At the same time, his guidance function continues even for those who pass only after doubt. Some texts include supplementary rites aimed at purifying small faults, the way legal systems distinguish between crimes and errors. Confession, amulets, offerings from the living, these do not bribe the scale but assist a borderline case to let go of what can be released. Anubis is not the source of mercy, but he is the organizer of procedures through which mercy can be applied without breaking measure. He knows what steps belong where, and he keeps them in order. Because the heart records intention as well as action, the weighing also dignifies restraint. Not doing harm has weight. Many lines in the negative confession deny acts that are easy to hide, stirring gossip that ruins a neighbor, damaging a dike for advantage, starving animals through neglect. The scale will register these as surely as it registers theft of grain. Anubis, who watched marketplaces and cemeteries alike, does not care if a wrongdoing was public or private. The pointer does not ask where a deed happened. It only asks what the deed did to Ma'at. When the balance settles and the indicator rests at center, the room relaxes. Thoth writes,
Amit recedes. The assessors nod. Anubis releases the pan chains and returns to the soul's side. In art, the next image often shows him again holding the person's hand, the same grip he used at the door, now used beyond the test. The continuity matters. The god who escorted the living to burial escorts the dead through judgment and then back into a community. He is not a specialist who vanishes after his task. He is the constant factor from the last breath to the first safe step in the next land. All of this ties back to a simple understanding of what Egyptians wanted from their gods: reliability, a sun that rises, a river that floods at the right season, a court that weighs fairly, a cemetery that remains quiet. Anubis is reliability at the most personal level. He makes sure the most important measurement a person will ever face is conducted without flaw. He does not soften standards, and he does not harden them past what Ma'at requires. He keeps them true. The work at the scale connects to another of his traits that returned again and again in temple instructions and workshop practice: secrecy. A process this sensitive must be protected from careless eyes and careless hands. The knowledge of oils, the timings of drying, the placement of amulets, the words that steady a frightened heart, all of it belongs to a guarded repertoire. The same God who checks the balance also keeps the door of the embalming house closed to the uninitiated. The more a culture depends on precision, the more it values custodians who keep procedures intact. Anubis is that custodian in the house of death. So when we ask whether he is judge or guide in the hall of the scale, the answer remains grounded. He is the guide who administers the test that makes judgment real. He is the technician who guarantees that the moral weight of a life is measured exactly against the standard that keeps the world from coming apart. He does not argue cases. He does not plead. He does not menace. He manages. And because he does,
Millions of lives, from kings wrapped in gold to farmers wrapped in linen, pass through the same measure with the same chance. The pointer settles, the feather rests, the heart tells the truth it has carried from the first breath. Anubis nods once, and the journey moves on to the rooms where skill and secrecy still wait behind another set of doors. The image of Anubis bending over the embalming table, his sleek black jackal head lowered toward the body, is one of the most enduring in Egyptian art. It is a picture of concentration, of ritual precision, of silence that conceals 1,000 hidden procedures. To the Egyptians, embalming was not merely a craft. It was a mystery, guarded jealously, spoken of only in fragments, conducted in workshops sealed from ordinary eyes. At the center of this mystery was Anubis, the keeper of secrets, the god whose very presence ensured that the work remained sacred and untouchable by the profane. The Egyptians spoke often about death, wrote extensively about the afterlife, decorated tombs with vivid scenes of the journey to eternity. Yet, when it came to embalming, the very process that made those journeys possible, they fell silent. Texts preserve only scattered instructions. Greek writers who witnessed it centuries later described the broad outlines but acknowledged that much was hidden from them. The secrecy was deliberate. The rites of mummification were not for public knowledge. They were mysteries known only to the initiated, preserved by tradition, and shielded by the god who had first embalmed Osiris. The embalming workshop, called the Per-Nefer, the House of Beauty or House of Purification, was not an ordinary space. It stood at the edge of the necropolis, close to tombs, but separate from homes and temples. Only embalmers and priests entered. Families brought their dead to its threshold, but did not see what happened inside. The doors closed, and the work began under the eyes of Anubis. The silence of the workshop mirrored the silence of the god himself. Just as he crouched at the tomb door, guarding the threshold, he crouched invisibly within the workshop, guarding the procedures that turned a corpse into an eternal body. The process lasted 70 days, a sacred number tied to the cycles of the stars, particularly the rising of Sirius and the flooding of the Nile. Each phase corresponded not only to practical needs, but to cosmic rhythms, drying with natron, washing, anointing, wrapping. Each act was timed, ordered, layered with meaning. Anubis was imagined as supervising every step. Priests wearing his mask performed the rites, speaking prayers that invoked his authority, handling the body as he had once handled Osiris. They were not merely technicians, they were imitators of the god who invented the procedure. The secrecy of the process was central. Knowledge of how to preserve a body was knowledge of how to extend existence itself. In Egyptian thought, the body was the anchor of the soul. If it decayed, the soul might dissolve into nothing. To protect it was to secure eternity. Such power could not be shared casually. It was reserved for a specialized brotherhood who lived apart from society, passing down their skills in silence. They guarded recipes for resins, techniques for wrapping, incantations for protecting the organs. To reveal these secrets to the uninitiated was to risk not only professional betrayal, but cosmic disorder. Anubis's role as keeper of secrets reflected this culture of guarded knowledge. He was the god of the hidden, of silence, of mysteries kept from the unworthy. His black jackal head, with its unblinking eyes, symbolized vigilance. He saw everything, but spoke nothing. In funerary texts, he is often called "he who is in the place of embalming," a title that locates him directly within the workshop. The secrecy of the embalmers was his secrecy. The silence of the workshop was his silence. The mysteries of mummification were not human inventions, but divine secrets he allowed mortals to borrow. The procedures themselves were elaborate. The body was first washed with palm wine and Nile water, cleansed of impurities. An incision was made to remove the internal organs, which were then embalmed separately and placed in canopic jars guarded by protective deities. The brain was often extracted through the nose and discarded, for the Egyptians did not see it as essential to identity. The heart, however, was preserved, for it was the seat of memory and conscience. Once emptied, the body was packed with natron, a natural salt, to dry it thoroughly. After 40 days, the dried body was washed again, then anointed with oils and resins to restore flexibility and scent. Finally, the long process of wrapping began. Each finger, each toe, each limb was wrapped separately, with amulets placed between layers for protection. Spells were recited as each section was bound. Linen bandages were coated with resin to glue them into place. Layer after layer transformed the body into a figure of permanence, smooth and shining. A mask, often gilded, was placed over the face to preserve identity. By the end, the body no longer looked like a corpse, but like an eternal form, protected against time and corruption. To the Egyptians, this was not artifice. It was transformation. The person had been remade into something death could not undo. What is striking is that so little of this is described in Egyptian texts themselves. Most of what we know comes from archaeology and from foreign observers like Herodotus. The Egyptians themselves spoke only in hints. In their own writing, embalming is described as the mysteries, the secret rites, the work of Anubis. This language suggests that the process was not just a technical operation, but a sacred initiation. The dead were not simply preserved, they were initiated into the mysteries of eternity. The secrecy itself was part of the power. What was hidden became sacred. What was unknown to the masses became effective for the individual. The embalmers themselves embodied this secrecy. They lived apart, often in settlements near cemeteries, bound by ritual purity. They were both respected and feared. Ordinary Egyptians relied on them absolutely, but also kept their distance. Handling corpses was polluting, but it was also holy. The embalmers carried a stigma, but also a sacred aura. They were servants of Anubis, imitators of the god of secrets. Their lives mirrored his paradox, guardians of the dead, yet feared by the living, keepers of sacred knowledge, yet silent about it. The act of wrapping the body in linen was itself a form of writing. Each bandage was inscribed with prayers, each knot tied with intention. The process turned the body into a scroll of protection, a text of linen and resin that spoke silently to the gods. Anubis was the author of this text. He had written the first version on Osiris's body, and every mummy thereafter was a copy of that original script. The secrecy of the process was not only about technique, it was about guarding the sacred language of preservation. To reveal it to outsiders would be to dilute its power. In this sense, Anubis was more than the god of embalming. He was the god of hidden knowledge. He embodied the principle that some truths are not to be shouted in marketplaces, but whispered in sanctuaries. His silence was not ignorance, but protection. By keeping the mysteries hidden, he kept them potent. The Egyptians believed that the divine worked most powerfully in silence, in secrecy, in what was shielded from casual eyes. Anubis personified that principle. The secrecy of mummification also carried a psychological function. To the living, death was terrifying. To hand a loved one's body to the embalmers and never see the process was to place absolute trust in the god and his priests. Families did not need to know every detail. They needed to know that Anubis was there, that the process was ancient, that it had worked for centuries. The hidden nature of the rites reassured them precisely because it was hidden. Mystery created confidence. What was secret was safe. At the same time, secrecy protected the dead from violation. If the techniques were not widely known, they could not be easily imitated or corrupted. The body was safeguarded by ignorance as much as by linen and resin. Anubis, as keeper of secrets, ensured that this ignorance persisted. He guarded not only the body, but the knowledge that preserved it. Even when Egypt came under Greek and Roman rule, and foreign writers described embalming in more detail, the aura of secrecy remained. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, describes 3 levels of embalming at different prices, from elaborate to simple. Yet he admits that much was hidden from him. He was an outsider, not an initiate. The most sacred aspects of the process remained veiled. This secrecy was deliberate and enduring, a sign of Anubis's continued authority. Archaeology has revealed much about embalming: the tools used, the resins applied, the bandages layered, but it has also confirmed how carefully secrecy was maintained. Workshops were temporary, built for specific bodies, then dismantled. Instructions were rarely written. Knowledge was oral, passed from master to apprentice. Even when embalming manuals survive from later periods, they are incomplete, coded, filled with symbolic language. The mysteries were never fully exposed, even in writing. To the Egyptians, this secrecy was not a flaw, but a necessity. The mysteries of mummification were part of the cosmic order. Just as the sun's journey through the underworld was unseen, so too was the journey of the body into eternity. Anubis oversaw both. His silence mirrored the silence of the cosmos. His secrets mirrored the secrets of death itself. He was the god who ensured that the most profound transition of human existence remained protected from profanation. The title, "He who is in the place of embalming," captures this perfectly. Anubis was not distant, not abstract. He was present in the workshop, in every resin, every bandage, every whispered spell. His presence guaranteed that what happened there remained hidden from the profane and effective for the sacred. He was the keeper of secrets, the master of mysteries, the god who turned death into transformation by means of rites no outsider could ever fully grasp. In the end, the secrecy itself became part of his power. The Egyptians did not need to know every step. They needed only to trust that Anubis was there, guiding hands, guarding knowledge, preserving bodies. That trust was enough to transform fear into assurance. To hand a loved one to the embalmers was to hand them to Anubis, the silent god of secrets, who had once embalmed Osiris and who continued to preserve all who followed. His mysteries remained veiled, but their results were visible in every mummy, every preserved face, every body transformed into an eternal form. The silence of the workshop was the silence of eternity itself, guarded forever by the jackal god who kept his secrets. The figure of Anubis is rarely isolated in Egyptian mythology. He moves constantly between other gods, sometimes subordinate, sometimes independent, sometimes a mediator, whose very neutrality makes him indispensable. Among the great divine family of Egypt, 3 names recur in connection with him more than any others: Osiris, Horus, and Set. Each represents a different pole of power: Osiris as the lord of the underworld, Horus as the living king of the sky, and Set as the force of chaos and violence. Anubis's relationship with these 3 defines much of his identity. He is both ally and rival, servant and equal, enemy and reconciler. In these shifting roles, we see how a jackal god, who began as a solitary guardian at the tomb door, became woven into the central drama of Egyptian religion. The story begins with Osiris. As the murdered king who became ruler of the dead, Osiris is the figure most closely tied to funerary beliefs. Yet before Osiris rose to prominence, Anubis already held sway over cemeteries and embalming. In the earliest pyramid texts, he is named foremost of the Westerners, the leader of the dead, long before Osiris is enthroned in the underworld. This suggests that Anubis once occupied a position of supreme authority in the funerary cult, later yielding some of that authority to Osiris when his myth grew dominant. But the transition was not erasure. Instead of being displaced, Anubis was integrated. He became the loyal embalmer who restored Osiris's body, the guardian who protected him, the one who enabled his resurrection. In myth, the god who could have been a rival became the indispensable servant. This shift reflects Egyptian religious logic. The pantheon did not eliminate older gods but redefined them. By tying Anubis to Osiris, the priests preserved his importance while harmonizing myth into a coherent story. Anubis became the artisan whose skill allowed Osiris to become king of the dead. Every embalming henceforth was a reenactment not only of Anubis's preservation of Osiris, but of the cosmic transfer of authority from jackal god to green-skinned ruler. This did not weaken Anubis. It made him essential. Osiris may have been king, but he owed his kingship to the one who stitched his body back together. The embalmer's craft was what made the king eternal. The relationship between Anubis and Osiris was not merely functional but also familial in some traditions. In one myth, Anubis is the son of Osiris and Nephthys, abandoned at birth and adopted by Isis. This lineage explained his loyalty. He was not only the embalmer of Osiris but his own son, repaying a father's gift of life with the gift of preservation. Other versions deny this paternity, making him older than Osiris, a primeval god whose authority predated the Assyrian court. But even in these cases, the connection remained. Whether as son or servant, Anubis was tied to Osiris through the act of embalming. He was the one who first bound his body, who invented the ritual that every human death imitated. In this sense, Osiris and Anubis were allies, their destinies entwined by death and preservation. The alliance deepened with Horus. As the son of Osiris and Isis, Horus was the avenger who defeated Set and restored balance to the cosmos. Anubis's role in this story was subtler, but no less important. He was often depicted as standing alongside Horus in rituals of kingship and protection. In temple scenes, the two appear together presenting offerings or purifying the king. This pairing symbolized the cooperation between embalmer and avenger, between the guardian of the dead and the protector of the living king. Horus represented the continuity of rulership on earth, Anubis the continuity of existence after death. Together they spanned the full cycle of human life, reign in this world and preservation in the next. In some traditions, Anubis even assists Horus directly in his struggle against Set. As the guide of the dead, he ensured that Osiris's soul was preserved and thus could witness his son's victory. Without Anubis, Osiris's murder might have been final. With him, it became the prelude to restoration. Horus's triumph was possible only because Anubis had kept the father whole. This made Anubis not only an ally of Osiris, but an enabler of Horus. He was the silent supporter who made justice possible, the one whose craft turned vengeance into cosmic renewal. And yet, Anubis was not always simply subordinate. His impartiality sometimes set him apart even from Horus. In the weighing of the heart, Anubis presided over the scale without favor, ensuring fairness for kings and commoners alike. This role could place him in quiet tension with Horus, who embodied royal authority. Horus was the god of kingship, but Anubis was the god of equality in death. In life, the pharaoh might rule as Horus incarnate, but in death, he faced Anubis's impartial scale like everyone else. In this sense, Anubis was both ally and rival to Horus, supporting the dynasty by ensuring continuity of the dead, but also undermining royal privilege by enforcing equality in the afterlife. The relationship with Set was more openly adversarial. As the murderer of Osiris and the god of chaos, Set was the great violator of funerary order. Where Anubis preserved, Set destroyed. Where Anubis kept silence, Set roared. Where Anubis respected boundaries, Set broke them. In myth, Anubis often appears as the foil to Set, repairing what he ruined, guarding against his desecration, preserving the corpse that Set had torn apart. Their opposition was cosmic: jackal against desert storm, preservation against chaos, guardian against violator. Yet the rivalry was complex. Some traditions named Anubis as the child of Set and Nephthys, making him the offspring of chaos itself. In this telling, the guardian of the dead was born from the violator of order. Far from diminishing him, this paradox intensified his authority. Who better to protect the tomb from Set than a son who knew his ways? Who better to guard against chaos than one who had sprung from it and turned against it? Anubis's impartiality meant that even if his bloodline linked him to Set, his loyalty lay with the preservation of order. He embodied the possibility of redeeming chaos by binding it to ritual. The rivalry also played out in geography. Set was associated with the desert, the barren wastes beyond the Nile's fertile banks. Anubis too belonged to the desert, haunting cemeteries at its edge. In this shared territory, the two gods clashed. Set represented the wildness of the desert, its storms and violence, its power to overwhelm. Anubis represented the order imposed on the desert, the cemeteries built on its slopes, the rituals performed in its silence. The desert was thus a battleground of meaning: chaos or order, destruction or preservation, Set or Anubis. In funerary scenes, this rivalry was often depicted symbolically. Anubis guarded the tomb while Set prowled outside. Anubis weighed the heart while Set's influence threatened to corrupt it. Anubis embalmed Osiris while Set scattered his body. Each act of preservation was an act of defiance against chaos. Each ritual that invoked Anubis was a rejection of Set. The opposition was not equal. Anubis did not fight with weapons, he fought with order, silence, ritual. But in the Egyptian worldview, that was the more enduring victory. Chaos raged for a moment, but preservation endured forever. This triad of relationships, Osiris, Horus, Set, defined Anubis's place in the pantheon. With Osiris, he was ally and servant, the one who preserved the body and made resurrection possible. With Horus, he was supporter and counterbalance, the guardian who ensured continuity, but also the equalizer who stripped kings of privilege in death. With Set, he was rival and opponent, the force of order against the force of chaos. Together, these relationships show a god who was never peripheral but always central, a figure who moved between roles with fluidity, always adapting, always necessary. The Egyptians embraced these complexities. They did not demand a single consistent genealogy or role. They allowed Anubis to be at once son of Osiris and older than Osiris, ally of Horus and rival to Horus, child of Set and enemy of Set. The contradictions were not flaws, but reflections of his liminal nature. As the jackal who prowled boundaries, Anubis belonged to paradox. His alliances and rivalries were not rigid categories, but shifting expressions of his position between worlds. The funerary cult absorbed these relationships into practice. Every embalming was an imitation of his preservation of Osiris. Every weighing of the heart was a reenactment of his impartial procedure. Every prayer against chaos invoked his opposition to Set. Every festival of kingship echoed his cooperation with Horus. He was woven into every ritual, every myth, every act of remembrance. His presence was constant, even when his role shifted. In the end, Anubis's relationships with Osiris, Horus, and Set highlight his most distinctive quality: his loyalty to order itself. He was not loyal to a single god, family, or dynasty. He was loyal to the principle that death required care, that cemeteries required guardians, that the transition from life to death required fairness. Whether serving Osiris, supporting Horus, or opposing Set, he acted from this same principle. He was impartial, incorruptible, indispensable. The jackal god moved silently between allies and rivals, never seeking the throne, always guarding the threshold. And in that constancy, he became one of the most enduring figures of the Egyptian pantheon. The god of embalming did not work alone. Every corpse that entered the house of beauty required human hands, and those hands belonged to a special class of men who carried both privilege and stigma. They were the priests of Anubis, his earthly representatives, men who dressed in black, who veiled their faces behind jackal masks, who spoke prayers in his name and repeated the gestures that myth had first attributed to him. To ordinary Egyptians, these priests were a mystery. They lived at the margins of society, near cemeteries and workshops, shrouded in secrecy. They were at once necessary and feared, indispensable and avoided. They were the human extension of Anubis himself, the silent custodians of death. The embalmer's settlement at Saqqara illustrates this paradox. Archaeological evidence shows that families of embalmers lived near the necropolis in quarters distinct from the living villages. They were close to the tombs they served, yet separate from the everyday life of the fields and markets. This separation was not accidental. To handle the dead was to handle pollution, a ritual impurity that ordinary people avoided. But it was also to handle holiness, the body that anchored the soul, the vessel that required divine preservation. The embalmers occupied a liminal space just like their god. They were neither fully inside ordinary society nor fully outside it. They were thresholds in human form. The priests in black were not a homogeneous group. Some were skilled artisans who specialized in drying bodies with natron, preparing resins, sewing wounds, or layering bandages. Others were ritualists who recited spells, conducted purifications, and oversaw offerings. Together, they formed a team, each with a role, each repeating what Anubis had once done for Osiris. The chief among them sometimes bore the title Hairy Seshta, meaning he who is over the secrets. This title captures the essence of their work. They were not only craftsmen but custodians of mysteries, guardians of knowledge that no outsider could learn. They kept the recipes of preservation, the timing of rituals, the placement of amulets. To reveal these secrets would have been to betray the god himself. The mask of Anubis was the most visible sign of their role. During key parts of the embalming ritual, one priest donned a jackal-headed mask, often crafted from wood or cartonnage and painted black. When he put it on, he was no longer a man, he was Anubis incarnate. Families watching from outside the tent believed they were seeing the god himself bending over the corpse. The priest was a vessel, his hands guided by divine precedent, his silence reflecting the god's eternal watchfulness. This moment was one of transformation, not only for the corpse, but for the living priest, who for a time became the god of embalming himself. Wearing the mask was not an honor taken lightly, it carried weight and danger. To become Anubis was to carry his impartiality, his incorruptibility. The priest was expected to act without greed, without negligence, without corruption. Any flaw in the ritual was not only a technical mistake, but a cosmic failure. The stakes were immense. Families paid for embalming with the assurance that their loved one's eternity depended on it. A careless priest could jeopardize a soul. The priest in black carried this burden every time he wore the mask. The clothing of these priests reinforced their identity. Black linen robes linked them directly to Anubis's own black skin, the color of death and rebirth. The black did not symbolize mourning alone, it symbolized transformation, the fertile soil of the Nile, the promise of renewal after decay. To dress in black was to become the god's extension, to embody his color, to signal his presence. These robes were not worn casually. They were ritual garments, donned in the house of beauty and removed when the rites were done. The priests of Anubis were also bound by ritual purity. Before handling the dead, they shaved their entire bodies, bathed in natron and water, and abstained from certain foods. Purification was constant. To touch the dead without purification was to risk pollution, but to be purified was to become a vessel, of sacred action. Their lives were filled with cycles of contamination and cleansing, mirroring the very process they enacted on corpses. They dried, purified, and wrapped bodies even as they themselves were purified to perform the task. Their work was an endless rhythm of decay and renewal, embodied not only in the corpses they touched, but in their own ritual state. The economic role of these priests cannot be ignored. Embalming was expensive. Families paid according to their means, from elaborate treatments lasting 70 days to simpler, quicker methods. The embalmers offered tiers of service, ensuring that even the poor could receive some preservation. This system placed them at the heart of funerary economy. They managed resources, negotiated prices, and maintained workshops stocked with costly resins imported from distant lands. Their craft tied them not only to religion, but to trade, medicine, and craftsmanship. To serve Anubis was also to run an enterprise that sustained whole communities. Yet their authority was always religious first. They were not ordinary businessmen, but ritualists whose work had eternal consequences. Inscriptions call them priests of Anubis and servants of the god who is in the place of embalming. Their economic transactions were framed within sacred duty. They did not simply sell preservation. They offered participation in the divine drama that began when Anubis embalmed Osiris. Every payment, every contract, was a contribution to that sacred reenactment. The priest in black was not only an artisan, but a mediator between families and the god who held eternity in his hands. This dual identity, artisan and priest, businessman and mystic, gave the embalmers a complex social standing. They were indispensable, for every family needed them, yet they were also feared, for their intimacy with death set them apart. Stories of embalmers being avoided in markets or marrying within their own communities reflect this ambivalence. They lived under Anubis's shadow, embodying his liminality. Just as the jackal god prowled between worlds, they lived between society and cemetery, between purity and pollution, between life and death. The secrecy of their work reinforced this separation. Outsiders rarely knew what happened inside the tent. The embalmers spoke in codes, used specialized terms, and guarded their procedures. Even Greek historians who described some of what they saw admitted that much remained hidden. The priests themselves cultivated this secrecy, for it gave their work authority. What was hidden was powerful. What was mysterious was sacred. By keeping their craft veiled, they ensured that families saw them not as mere workers, but as custodians of divine mysteries. The connection between Anubis and his priests was not only symbolic, but also experiential. In their daily work, they experienced what he had experienced, handling bodies, confronting decay, transforming flesh into permanence. They repeated his myth in action, becoming his human mirrors. In this sense, the priest in black was not just a representative of Anubis, but a participant in his eternal task. Every bandage wrapped, every jar sealed, every prayer whispered was part of the same continuum that began with Osiris's embalming. The god and the priest were inseparable in function. The fear that surrounded these priests was balanced by reverence. Families prayed for them, asking that they act faithfully. In some texts, Anubis himself is asked to guide the hands of embalmers to ensure that no mistake is made. This reveals the deep trust Egyptians placed in them despite their marginal status. They carried the community's most sacred responsibility to ensure that death was not the end. Their work was not glamorous, but it was profound. Even after Egypt's political fortunes declined and foreign powers ruled the land, the embalmers of Anubis continued their work. In Greek and Roman times, mummification persisted, and priests still donned the jackal mask. The god's human servants endured, adapting to new contexts, but preserving the old mysteries. Their persistence reflects the durability of Anubis's cult. Even when other gods rose and fell, the need for embalming remained, and with it, the need for priests in black. The priests of Anubis thus embodied his character in human form. They were secretive, impartial, tireless, working in silence at the edge of society. They were both feared and necessary, stigmatized and revered. They lived liminal lives, reflecting the liminal nature of the god they served. By becoming his servants, they became his extensions. The mask of Anubis they wore was not only a ritual disguise, but a mirror of their identity. They were Anubis in flesh, guardians of death, keepers of secrets, artisans of eternity. The great temples of Egypt were built for gods of the sky and the river, for Ra and Amun, for Horus and Hathor, for the deities whose power was celebrated in daylight processions and festivals. Their pylons towered over cities, their columns rose like forests of stone, their walls were inscribed with hymns that declared the triumph of order over chaos. These temples were public, open to processions, filled with offerings, and designed to impress. Anubis, by contrast, did not belong to that world. His sanctuaries were quieter, humbler, and more secretive. He was not a god of open display, but of hidden spaces. His temples were often at the edges of necropolises, his shrines tucked into deserts. His presence felt not in festivals, but in the silence of burial grounds. This difference reflected his nature. Anubis was a god of thresholds, of liminality, of the passage between life and death. His domain was not the bustling center of cities, but the border where cultivation ended and desert began. His temples mirrored this geography. They were not monuments meant to dominate skylines. They were stations meant to guard boundaries. To worship Anubis was not to gather in crowded festivals, but to enter the hush of the necropolis, to leave behind the noise of the living world and step into the silence where he dwelled. At Saqqara, the vast cemetery near Memphis, archaeologists have uncovered chapels dedicated to Anubis within larger temple complexes. These were not grand halls, but small sanctuaries, often connected to embalming houses. Families could bring offerings here, asking Anubis to guard their loved ones, to oversee the rites of mummification, to ensure safe passage into the afterlife. The shrines were often simple, but their simplicity carried weight. The god of secrets did not require monumental grandeur. He required presence at the right place, the threshold of death. Other shrines were more hidden still. At Abydos, one of the most sacred sites in Egypt associated with the cult of Osiris, Anubis had his own chapels, tucked into the desert cliffs where tombs clustered. Pilgrims who came to honor Osiris also brought offerings to Anubis, acknowledging that no journey to the god of the dead could bypass the guardian who had embalmed him. In this way, Anubis's shrines were woven into larger cults without ever losing their distinct character. They were liminal within liminal spaces, hidden chapels within necropolises that were themselves set apart from cities. The desert itself was Anubis's temple. The jackal who prowled its ridges was his living image. Shrines placed along desert roads or near cemeteries were markers of his presence, reminders that he was always watching. Travelers passing through the necropolis might stop at a small altar, leave food or incense, and move on, knowing they had acknowledged the silent guardian. These shrines were not about grandeur, but about continuity, about maintaining contact with the god who dwelled in silence. Some shrines to Anubis were associated with embalming workshops. Here, the god's presence was invoked directly in the space where bodies were prepared. Wooden statues of Anubis crouched on shrines overseeing the work. Priests wore his mask, embodying him in ritual. The workshop itself became a kind of temple, a sacred space where every act was performed under his gaze. The walls may have been temporary, but the god's presence was permanent. These hidden temples were not made of stone, but of ritual, of secrecy, of action repeated in his name. The secrecy of his shrines mirrored the secrecy of his cult. Unlike the great gods whose myths were sung in public, Anubis's mysteries were whispered, guarded, hidden. His temples were not places of spectacle, but of initiation. Those who entered encountered not festivals but silence, not hymns but prayers spoken in low voices. To worship him was not to proclaim, but to trust, to enter into the hiddenness that defined his very character. In some periods, especially during the late period and into Greco-Roman Egypt, Anubis's shrines gained more prominence. He was sometimes merged with Hermes into Hermanubis, a syncretic figure who combined the roles of psychopomp from both cultures. In these contexts, his temples became more public, reflecting foreign influence. Yet, even then, the core of his cult remained secretive. He was still tied to cemeteries, still present in embalming rituals, still the god of hidden places. His temples might be more visible, but his essence was unchanged. The desert shrines also served a psychological function. To approach them was to leave behind ordinary life, to confront mortality, to acknowledge death. They reminded Egyptians that death was not far away, that it lurked at the edge of the fields, that it demanded recognition. By placing shrines to Anubis at these edges, society created a space where death could be acknowledged without terror. The shrine was a place of control, of order, of guardianship. It said that death was not chaos, but ritual, not abandonment, but preservation. The presence of Anubis's shrines at necropolises also reinforced social continuity. Families visited them not only to honor the dead, but to remind themselves of their obligations. Offerings were not only gifts for the deceased, but affirmations of family loyalty, of memory preserved. Anubis stood as witness to these acts. His shrines were not just places of worship, but places of accountability. To neglect them was to risk neglecting one's ancestors. To honor them was to keep the chain of remembrance unbroken. Unlike the towering temples of Thebes or Karnak, Anubis's shrines rarely survive in monumental form. They were smaller, more perishable, more integrated into cemeteries than separate structures. But their absence in stone does not mean absence in history. Their traces are found in inscriptions, in statues, in the constant invocation of Anubis's name in funerary texts. His hidden temples were everywhere, woven into the fabric of Egyptian burial practice. They did not dominate skylines, but they dominated the imagination of death. The contrast between Anubis's hidden shrines and the grand temples of other gods highlights his unique character. He was not a god of public life, but of private passage. His sanctuaries were not for crowds, but for families, not for festivals, but for rituals of mourning and preservation. His temples were hidden because death itself was hidden, a mystery guarded from the profane. To enter them was to step into another world, a world of silence and secrecy, overseen by the black jackal who never slept. Even today, when visitors walk among the ruins of Saqqara or the Valley of the Kings, they can sense this difference. The grand tombs impress with their size, their paintings, their inscriptions, but the smaller chapels, the statues of Anubis crouching in corners, the altars tucked into desert cliffs, these carry a different weight. They are not spectacular, but they are intimate. They speak of a god who was always present, always watching, always guarding, even when unseen. The hidden temples and desert shrines of Anubis remind us that religion in Egypt was not only about grandeur, but about intimacy, not only about public spectacle, but about private assurance.
They show us a God who worked in silence, whose power was not in display but in secrecy, whose temples were hidden because death itself is hidden. To honor him was to step into that secrecy, to acknowledge the mystery, to trust the guardian who kept watch over every tomb and every soul. Anubis's temples may not tower over the desert like Karnak or Luxor, but their influence was no less enduring. They were the stations of eternity, the hidden sanctuaries where life and death touched. To enter them was to step into the silence of the necropolis, to stand before the god of thresholds, to place one's trust in the keeper of secrets. And though the stone of these shrines may have crumbled, the memory of their silence endures, as eternal as the jackal who watched from the desert ridges.
When the Greeks first arrived in Egypt, they entered a world that was already ancient. The temples of Karnak and Abydos had stood for more than 1,000 years, the pyramids had towered over the desert for twice that span, and the rites of embalming had been perfected into rituals of silence and secrecy. To the Egyptians, Anubis was an old and trustworthy guardian, a god who had been watching over tombs since the earliest kings. But to the Greeks and later the Romans, who came with different traditions, different philosophies and different fears, the black jackal-headed god looked strange, alien, even unsettling. What Egyptians saw as the guardian of the dead, foreigners sometimes saw as a monster. In their eyes, Anubis shifted from god to demon, from protector to spectre, from familiar presence to exotic hybrid. The Greeks had their own guide of souls, Hermes Psychopompos, the swift messenger who escorted the dead to Hades. When they encountered Anubis, they quickly recognized a similarity. Both were liminal figures, moving between worlds, escorting souls across thresholds. But Hermes was young, bright, winged, a cheerful traveler who carried a staff. Anubis was dark, silent, jackal-headed, associated with corpses and mummies. Where Hermes was approachable, Anubis was uncanny. To reconcile the two, the Greeks invented a syncretic figure, Hermanubis. In art, this god appears as a man with a jackal head, or sometimes a man with a human head, but carrying symbols of both Hermes and Anubis. He became a way for Greeks to translate the Egyptian cult into familiar language, to say, this strange jackal god is really just our Hermes in another form. But even as they created Hermanubis, they could not escape the unease that Anubis inspired. Greek writers often described him in mocking or fearful terms. They called him the dog-headed one, treating his appearance as grotesque. To them, animal-headed gods seemed monstrous, blending categories that should remain separate. Where Egyptians saw sacred symbolism, Greeks saw hybrid deformity. Herodotus, who traveled in Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described mummification with curiosity, but never fully hid his discomfort with the priests who wore jackal masks. To the Greek mind, a human face concealed beneath an animal mask was disturbing, a breach of the natural order. This unease deepened under the Romans. Roman authors, steeped in their own pantheon of anthropomorphic gods, often treated Anubis as a figure of mockery or menace. In the Roman poet Juvenal's satires, he appears as part of a parade of bizarre Egyptian deities, lumped together with ibis-headed Thoth and crocodile-shaped Sobek. To Juvenal, worshipping a dog-headed god was a sign of Egyptian folly, a symbol of superstition and excess. The Romans prided themselves on their rationality, their sense of order, their distrust of what they saw as foreign decadence. Anubis became a convenient symbol of everything they thought was wrong with Egypt. Yet the same Romans who mocked him could not resist his allure. In magical papyri from Roman Egypt, Anubis appears again and again as a powerful name to be invoked in spells. Magicians called on him to open the way, to summon spirits, to guard tombs, to reveal secrets. In these texts, he is not mocked but feared, treated as a potent force of the underworld. His jackal head, which seemed grotesque to Roman poets, became a mark of his power in magical circles. The same strangeness that made him a figure of ridicule also made him irresistible to those who dealt in hidden knowledge. The transformation from god to demon was partly cultural. To Egyptians, death was not terrifying, in the same way it was to Greeks and Romans. They embraced it as part of order, a passage guarded by Anubis, made safe through ritual. To foreigners, the practices of mummification seemed morbid, unnatural. Preserving corpses, wrapping them in linen, filling them with resins. All this struck Greeks and Romans as grotesque. They preferred cremation, a swift disposal of the body, freeing the soul from flesh. To them, the Egyptian devotion to preserving bodies looked like clinging to death, a kind of obsession. And Anubis, as the god of embalming, embodied this obsession. He was the symbol of what they found strange in Egyptian religion. This cultural difference shaped how Anubis was interpreted in literature and art. In Roman paintings, he sometimes appears not as a dignified guardian, but as a sinister figure, half man, half dog, lurking in the shadows. In Christian texts of late antiquity, he begins to merge with demonic imagery, part of a larger polemic against pagan gods. To early Christians, animal-headed deities were not symbols, but demons, deceptive spirits that misled nations into idolatry. Anubis, with his jackal face, became for them a clear sign of the monstrous. The god who had once preserved Osiris now stood in Christian imagination as a demon of the underworld. And yet, even in this demonization, traces of his older dignity survived. Anubis continued to be worshipped in parts of the Roman Empire, especially in Alexandria, where Greek and Egyptian traditions blended. Coins minted under Roman emperors sometimes bore his image, showing that even the conquerors recognized his enduring power. Temples dedicated to him existed in Rome itself, where Egyptian cults had taken root among immigrants and seekers of foreign gods. The very city that mocked him also gave him a place of worship. The ambiguity of Anubis under Greek and Roman eyes reveals how powerful his image was. He could not be ignored. He inspired both ridicule and reverence, both fear and worship. And his jackal face was too strange, too haunting, too deeply tied to death to be assimilated fully into Greek and Roman categories. So he became many things at once. Anubis, the guide of souls. Anubis, the grotesque foreign god. Anubis, the demon of Christian polemic. Anubis, the powerful name in magical spells. Each culture reshaped him according to its fears and desires, but none could erase him. This transformation from god to demon was not the end of his story. In fact, it preserved him. By becoming a figure of fear, he remained relevant. By entering magical texts, he survived beyond the temples. By haunting Christian imagination, he lived on as a warning. The Egyptians had always seen him as a liminal figure, standing between life and death, silence and speech, human and animal. Under Greek and Roman eyes, he became liminal in another way, between god and demon, between reverence and ridicule, between foreign cult and local suspicion. His ambiguity was his endurance. What Greeks and Romans could never fully grasp was that Anubis was not monstrous to Egyptians because he was not meant to be human. He was the embodiment of the jackal, the scavenger turned guardian, the animal that prowled cemeteries transformed into a god who protected them. To Egyptians, this was not grotesque, but profound. To Greeks and Romans, it was alien. In their misunderstanding, they made him a demon. But in doing so, they only confirmed what Egyptians had always known, that Anubis belonged to the shadows, to the edges, to the places where fear and reverence meet. The irony is that the very cultures that mocked Anubis also preserved his memory. Without Greek and Roman writers, we would know less of how his cult adapted in later periods. Without Roman magical papyri, we would see less of his endurance in secret rites. Without Christian polemic, we might forget how vividly his image lingered as paganism declined. In turning him into a demon, they ensured his survival. His jackal face continued to haunt imaginations long after his temples crumbled. The journey of Anubis under Greek and Roman eyes reminds us that gods are never fixed. They change as cultures shift, as empires rise and fall, as new eyes interpret old symbols. For Egyptians, he was the loyal embalmer, the guardian of cemeteries, the impartial weigher of hearts. For Greeks, he He was a foreign hybrid, a grotesque curiosity. For Romans, he was both exotic cult figure and demonic caricature. For Christians, he was a demon to be exorcised. Through it all, his face remained black and sleek, watching from the desert, waiting at the tomb door. No ridicule, no polemic, no reinterpretation could erase him. The jackal god endured, even in the mouths of those who feared and mocked him. When Christianity spread through Egypt, it brought with it an entirely new way of speaking about gods and spirits. The old pantheon that had endured for millennia was reclassified almost overnight. Isis, Osiris, Horus, Thoth, Anubis, figures who had been protectors and companions for generations, were now described as demons. Their temples were closed, their priests denounced, their rituals forbidden. Yet in Egypt, memory was never so easily erased. The gods had been woven into every aspect of daily life for thousands of years. To abandon them in name did not mean to forget them in practice. Anubis, the black jackal who had crouched at tomb doors for longer than memory, survived in the shadows of Christian Egypt, stripped of his divine titles, but still present in imagination, in rumor, and in the hidden corners of ritual. The Church Fathers were explicit in their condemnation. To them, animal-headed gods were proof of Egypt's superstition, grotesque reminders of a pagan past that had to be eradicated. In sermons and treatises, Anubis became a symbol of demonic deception, a jackal spirit that misled the people into worshipping animals rather than the true God. His role as embalmer, which had once been sacred, was denounced as morbid obsession. His silence, once seen as vigilance, was recast as sinister. Christian polemic painted him as a demon of death, a reminder of the devil's grip on the land before Christ. And yet, archaeology shows that the transition was not so simple. Temples dedicated to Anubis were sometimes repurposed as churches, but the statues were not always destroyed. In some cases, they were buried carefully, hidden rather than smashed, as though even Christians feared to desecrate them outright. This caution suggests that Anubis still carried weight, even if only as a dangerous memory. To destroy him entirely may have felt like tempting misfortune. Better to bury him under the floor, to silence him by concealment, than to risk his wrath by violence. In popular imagination, Anubis lingered as a figure of fear. Christian texts from late antiquity mention jackal-headed demons that haunted cemeteries and deserts. These were clearly echoes of the old god, reinterpreted as hostile spirits. Where once Egyptians had prayed to him for protection against wandering souls, Christians now warned one another that the jackal figure itself was the threat. The role was inverted, but the presence remained. The black shape in the desert was no longer the guardian, but the danger. Yet the very need to warn against him shows how deeply his image persisted. He could not be erased, he could only be recast. At the same time, some of his functions were quietly absorbed into Christian practice. The Christian burial tradition in Egypt placed strong emphasis on the body, on preparing it carefully, on watching over cemeteries. While embalming faded, the care of the corpse remained central. Vigil lamps were lit at graves, prayers were said for the dead, cemeteries became places of pilgrimage. In this new context, Christ and the saints replaced Anubis as guardians, but the continuity of practice shows that his shadow still lay behind it. The very idea that cemeteries needed constant vigilance, that the dead were not to be abandoned, was an inheritance from the jackal god. Even in Christian art, faint traces of him remained. Coptic textiles from late antiquity sometimes depict canine figures near burial scenes, not labeled as Anubis, but unmistakably recalling his form. These images may have been meant as demons, or they may simply reflect the persistence of memory in artistic traditions. Either way, the jackal head endured, surviving in threads and patterns long after his temples were gone. Anubis had moved from god to demon, from protector to shadow. But he was still present. Magic, too, kept him alive. Despite the church's condemnation, magical practices continued in Egypt well into the Christian era. In Coptic magical texts, names of pagan gods often appear alongside Christian invocations, mixed together in a strange syncretism. Anubis is among them, sometimes called upon to open the way or to bind spirits. To Christians, this was demonic magic. To practitioners, it was ancient power still effective. The secrecy of his cult in earlier times made the transition easier. Anubis had always been a god of hidden rites, of silence, of mysteries kept from the public. In Christian Egypt, this secrecy simply deepened. He became a figure invoked in whispers, remembered in spells, feared even as he was used. Legends of haunted cemeteries also preserved his presence. Christian monks living in the desert often wrote of being attacked by demons that took the form of animals, jackals, dogs, wolves, that prowled near their cells. These demons were described as testing their faith, trying to lure them back into pagan fear. Yet the descriptions echo Anubis too closely to be coincidence. The monks were encountering the memory of the old god in the desert night, his form now stripped of holiness, but still haunting the landscape he had guarded for millennia. The transformation of Anubis in Christian Egypt reflects a broader pattern of continuity beneath change. Officially, he was gone, condemned, demonized, forbidden. In practice, he lingered in fears, in rituals, in art, in the persistence of imagination. He survived not as a god of temples, but as a ghost of memory. His silence became the silence of the forbidden, his secrecy, the secrecy of hidden rites. He lived on in shadows because shadows had always been his home. It is striking that even in Christian burial prayers, echoes of his impartiality can be heard. The emphasis on fairness in judgment, on the soul being tested, on the need for purity of heart. These were concepts shaped by Egyptian funerary tradition. The scale may have been replaced by Christ's judgment, but the idea that death involved a reckoning remained. Anubis, who had once checked the balance of the heart, left behind a template that even Christianity could not discard. His role was recast, but his influence remained. Over centuries, as Christianity became dominant and memories of the old gods faded further, Anubis retreated deeper into legend. In Coptic folklore, jackal-headed demons became stock figures, embodiments of the dangers of the desert. To whisper his name was to invoke fear, but also to acknowledge continuity with the past. Even those who condemned him could not fully detach from the memory that the cemeteries once belonged to him. The desert did not forget. The jackals still prowled. The silence still carried his weight. This survival in the shadows was not triumph, but it was endurance. Anubis did not reign as he once had. He did not receive offerings openly, did not stand in temples, did not guide embalming priests in daylight, but he persisted in imagination, in fear, in ritual echoes. He survived because he had always been a god of secrecy, because his power had never relied on spectacle. While other gods needed festivals, Anubis thrived in silence. When the festivals ended, he remained. By the time Islam spread through Egypt, the memory of Anubis had faded further, subsumed into older legends of demons and spirits. But even then, traces of him persisted in folklore about desert guardians and spectral dogs that haunted ruins. His form had changed again, but his endurance remained. The god of the tomb door had become a demon in Christian eyes, then a spirit in Muslim folklore, but always he remained tied to death, to cemeteries, to the silence of the desert. The story of Anubis in Christian Egypt is not one of worship, but of haunting. He survived not in temples, but in whispers, not in hymns, but in warnings, not in statues, but in shadows. The jackal god endured because he had always belonged to the margins. When the center shifted, he did not vanish. He simply remained where he had always been, at the threshold, silent, watchful, waiting. By the time the Middle Ages dawned in Europe, the temples of Egypt had long been silent. The last priests of Anubis had whispered their prayers centuries earlier, their workshops dismantled, their rites forbidden. Christianity had swept across the Nile, recasting the jackal-headed god as a demon, and Rome had collapsed into fragments. Yet memory is never so easily erased. Across the Mediterranean world, fragments of Egyptian religion had traveled with merchants, scholars, soldiers, and pilgrims. In those fragments, Anubis lingered. His name was distorted, his face misremembered, his role misunderstood. But in the imagination of medieval Europe, faint echoes of the jackal god survived. They haunted manuscripts, appeared in bestiaries, whispered in magical texts, and surfaced in tales of demons and spectral dogs. The guardian of tombs endured, even when stripped of his name. The Middle Ages inherited Egypt through the lens of Rome. Classical writers, Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, Juvenal, had written about Egyptian gods, often with fascination, often with ridicule. Their works survived in monasteries, copied by scribes who preserved pagan knowledge, even while condemning it. In these texts, Anubis appeared again and again as the dog-headed god. To the monks who read these accounts, he was no longer a protector of the dead, but a curiosity, a monstrous hybrid from a strange land. Yet the act of copying his image into manuscripts ensured that he remained alive in memory. Every scribe who traced his name, every reader who puzzled over his form, carried the echo of the jackal forward. Medieval bestiaries, collections of animal lore that combined natural observation with allegory, sometimes included references to Egyptian practices. In these, the jackal was described as a desert scavenger, an unclean animal, a symbol of deceit or greed. Behind these descriptions lay the shadow of Anubis. The animal that had once been divine in Egypt became a moral warning in Europe. The jackal prowled not cemeteries but sermons, where it served as an allegory for sin. The transformation was radical, but the connection endured. The jackal remained associated with death, with the desert, with danger. His sacredness had vanished, but his symbolism persisted. In magical texts, the echoes were stronger. The Greek magical papyri, filled with invocations of Anubis, were copied and adapted into medieval grimoires. In these, the jackal god was no longer called by his Egyptian name, but disguised within strings of foreign-sounding words, mysterious syllables meant to command spirits. Medieval magicians invoked the dog-headed one to summon the dead, to open gates, to control demons. They may not have known they were calling on Anubis, but the lineage was clear. The rituals that had once whispered his name in the necropolis now whispered distorted versions in candlelit chambers across Europe. His role as keeper of thresholds endured, even when hidden under layers of corruption and fear. The figure of the cynocephaly, the dog-headed men, also carried echoes of Anubis. Medieval travelers' tales spoke of distant lands where tribes of men with dog heads lived, savage and strange. These myths likely drew on distorted accounts of Egyptian gods, including Anubis. In Christian writings, cynocephaly were sometimes described as monstrous races descended from Cain, condemned to roam the earth as half human, half animal. Yet even as monsters, they were strangely familiar. They resembled Anubis, stripped of divinity, turned into a symbol of the monstrous other. The jackal god had become a race of dog-headed men, feared at the edges of the world. Legends of spectral dogs in medieval Europe may also carry traces of Anubis. Across England, Germany, and France, people told stories of black dogs that haunted roads and cemeteries, eyes glowing, bodies huge and shadowy, omens of death. These black dogs, known as the Barghest, the Black Shuck, the Church Grim, were seen as spirits of the dead or guardians of graveyards. Scholars have long debated their origin, but the resemblance to Anubis is striking. a black canine that guards cemeteries, that appears as a liminal figure between life and death, that inspires both fear and reverence. This is precisely Anubis's ancient role. The black dog of medieval folklore may not have been consciously linked to Egypt, but it carried the same archetype. The jackal god had migrated into European imagination as a ghostly hound. Even in art, faint traces appear. In illuminated manuscripts that depict scenes of judgment, strange hybrid figures sometimes appear at the edges, part demon, part animal, watching as souls are weighed. Though these are labelled as devils, their resemblance to Anubis is suggestive. The weighing of the heart had long vanished from European religion, replaced by the Christian Last Judgment, yet the image of a scale remained. And at times, beside that scale, a dark figure with animal traits appears, a distorted echo of the jackal who once checked the balance. The Egyptian god survived as a shadow in Christian art, transformed into a devil, but still haunting the scale of judgment. The survival of Anubis in medieval Europe was thus fragmentary, distorted, and indirect. He did not appear in prayers or hymns, he was not worshipped openly, but he lived on in whispers, in fears, in symbols. He was remembered as a monster, a demon, a spectral dog, a hybrid man. His sacredness was gone, but his liminality remained. He still marked the threshold between life and death, still appeared in cemeteries, still guarded in shadow. The Europeans who spoke of black dogs on lonely roads, or of dog-headed tribes in distant lands, or of demonic figures weighing souls, were unknowingly echoing a god who had once been the most trusted guardian of death. This distorted survival shows the endurance of archetypes. Anubis had embodied the black dog of the cemetery, the silent guardian of thresholds. Even when his name was forgotten, the archetype remained. Cultures reinterpreted it in their own ways. Christians turned it into a demon, Europeans into folklore of spectral hounds, travelers into tales of monstrous races. But the core image endured. The black dog at the threshold could not be erased. It haunted imagination across time and space. By the late Middle Ages, as Europe entered the Renaissance, scholars began to rediscover Egyptian texts through Arabic translations and through contact with the Byzantine Empire. In these rediscoveries, Anubis appeared again, now as part of a revived interest in ancient wisdom. Renaissance magicians like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola studied Egyptian lore, drawing on Hermetic texts that blended Greek, Egyptian, and Christian ideas. In this context, Anubis resurfaced not as a demon, but as a symbol of ancient knowledge. His demonization in Christian polemic was tempered by admiration for Egypt's antiquity, yet even here, he remained shadowy, half forgotten, half reinvented. The echoes of Anubis in medieval Europe remind us that gods never truly vanish.
They change, they hide, they linger in folklore, in fears, in symbols that outlive temples. Anubis survived as a demon, as a monster, as a ghostly hound. He was no longer the embalmer of Osiris, no longer the impartial weigher of hearts, no longer the keeper of secrets in the house of beauty, but he endured as shadow, as echo, as memory. The black jackal who once crouched at tomb doors now prowled in medieval imagination as the black dog on the road, the demon at the scale, the monstrous cynocephalus at the edge of the world. His name was forgotten, but his presence remained. And in that persistence, even in distortion, lies a kind of victory. The god who thrived in secrecy continued to live in secrecy, hidden in legends, disguised as monsters, whispered as demons. He had always belonged to the margins, to the places beyond light. In medieval Europe, he remained there, surviving in echoes, haunting the imagination of a world that thought it had forgotten him. By the time Europe entered the age of exploration and the first mummies began arriving in its ports, Anubis had been silent for centuries. His temples had crumbled, his priests had vanished, his name survived only in fragments of classical texts,
and the distorted shadows of medieval imagination. Yet the modern era brought him back to life in a new and unexpected form. As antiquarians unwrapped mummies in candlelit salons, as esoteric societies searched for ancient wisdom, as occultists scoured the ruins of Egypt for hidden knowledge, Anubis re-emerged, not as the god of the Nile, but as a symbol in Western esoterica. He was reborn, reinvented, reinterpreted, woven into the fabric of modern occultism, where his jackal head became once again a mark of guardianship, secrecy, and passage between worlds. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a wave of fascination with Egypt that scholars call Egyptomania. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt brought back not only soldiers but scholars who studied temples, copied hieroglyphs, and filled Europe with images of sphinxes, obelisks, and pyramids. Museums in Paris, London, and Berlin filled with artifacts, statues of Osiris, amulets of Isis, papyri of the Book of the Dead. Among them were countless depictions of Anubis, jackal-headed statues crouched on shrines, funerary papyri showing him weighing hearts, amulets bearing his black form. To the public, he was exotic and mysterious. To occultists, he was revelation. They saw in him not just an ancient god, but a key to secret wisdom. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 and its eventual decipherment by Champollion in the 1820s allowed the modern world to read Egyptian texts again. Suddenly, hymns to Anubis, funerary spells invoking his name, and titles calling him Lord of the Sacred Land became accessible. Occultists seized upon this material eagerly. They were convinced that Egypt held the original mysteries of humanity, the primal religion from which all others had descended. If Isis represented divine motherhood and Osiris resurrection, then Anubis represented the mysteries of death itself. His image became a favorite of secret societies, a guardian of initiation, the silent figure at the threshold of hidden knowledge. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in the late 19th century, placed Egyptian gods at the heart of its rituals. Anubis was among them, invoked as a psychopomp, a guide of initiates through the symbolic death that marked entry into higher grades. Members dressed in black robes, masks, and symbols recalling his jackal head. To them, Anubis was no longer just an ancient funerary deity, but the archetypal guardian of initiation. Just as he had once guided souls through the underworld, he now guided initiates through the mysteries of esoteric knowledge. The embalming chamber became a metaphor for the ritual lodge. The transformation of the corpse became the transformation of the self. Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society also embraced Egyptian imagery, treating Anubis as a symbol of occult guardianship. In theosophical writings, he appears as the silent keeper of ancient wisdom, a figure who represents the hidden truths preserved from humanity's earliest civilizations. Anubis's role as keeper of secrets resonated perfectly with esoteric movements obsessed with hidden knowledge. His silence was no longer about funerary workshops in Memphis, but about cosmic mysteries accessible only to initiates. He became a timeless guardian of esoteric truth, his jackal head watching over those who sought enlightenment. Freemasonry, too, incorporated echoes of Anubis. Though not always by name, Masonic ritual often included imagery of guardians at thresholds, figures who watched over the symbolic journey from death to rebirth. In some Egyptian-inspired Masonic rites, Anubis was explicitly invoked as the guardian of the West, the one who oversaw the transformation of the initiate. His impartiality, his secrecy, his association with embalming, all became metaphors for the disciplined preservation of Masonic knowledge. The jackal god found a new place in the ritual architecture of modern brotherhoods. Occult literature of the 19th century often depicted him in romanticized form. Artists portrayed him standing tall, staff in hand, jackal head sleek and dignified, often surrounded by hieroglyphs and pyramids. In these images, he was not grotesque, but noble, a symbol of ancient wisdom rediscovered. The ridicule of Juvenal and the demonization of Christian polemic had faded. Anubis was once again a figure of reverence, though transformed into something Western seekers could understand. He was the guide of the soul, the silent guardian of mystery, the archetype of initiation. The fascination extended into popular culture as well. In Victorian England, unwrapping mummies became a fashionable spectacle, and Anubis was invoked in the imagination as the god who watched over these ancient bodies. Gothic novels and poems referred to him as the jackal-headed guardian, the silent watcher in the tomb. To audiences enthralled by both science and the supernatural, Anubis embodied the uncanny mixture of death, preservation, and mystery. He was exotic, eerie, yet oddly reassuring, a symbol that death was not annihilation, but transition. In the 20th century, as occultism evolved into new forms, Anubis continued to appear. In the works of Aleister Crowley, Egyptian gods were central to magical practice. Crowley's Book of the Law, received in Cairo in 1904, claimed to channel Egyptian deities, and though Anubis himself is not the central figure, his presence lurks in the background of Crowley's ritual world. Later, occultists, neo-pagans, and ceremonial magicians adopted Anubis explicitly, invoking him in rituals of death and rebirth, in meditations on the underworld, in practices of divination and guidance. He became a staple of esoteric pantheons, his jackal head a symbol on altars and in grimoires. New Age movements of the late 20th century softened his image further. Books on spiritual guides and afterlife journeys described Anubis as a compassionate helper, a guide who comforted souls at death, who ensured safe passage to the other side. He became less the stern guardian of scales and more the gentle psychopomp, reinterpreted for audiences who preferred comfort to impartiality. In this form, he became popular in meditation practices, visualizations, and modern pagan rituals. His black jackal face was no longer feared but welcomed, a symbol of continuity beyond death. In modern esoterica, Anubis also reappears in tarot, in oracle decks, in meditation guides. Cards depict him as the guardian of transition, the one who opens the way between stages of life. Occult shops sell statues of him as protectors of homes, echoing his ancient role as protector of tombs. His image has become part of a global esoteric vocabulary, recognized even by those who know little of Egyptian mythology. The jackal head signals guardianship, secrecy, and transformation. He has been reborn as an archetype of spiritual transition, detached from temples but alive in practice.
The endurance of Anubis in modern occultism reveals something profound. He was always a god of secrecy, of hidden rites, of mysteries guarded from outsiders. That secrecy made him adaptable. When temples fell, his silence became the silence of forgotten cults. When Christianity condemned him, his secrecy made him linger in whispers. When modern seekers searched for hidden wisdom, his secrecy made him their perfect symbol. He never needed public festivals or grand temples. He thrived in hiddenness. That same hiddenness made him easy to adopt into esoteric traditions that valued mystery above all. Today, Anubis stands at the crossroads of history and imagination. He is an ancient god, reborn as an occult symbol. He is the embalmer of Osiris, remembered in museums and textbooks, and he is the psychopomp of meditation circles, guiding souls through visualized afterlife journeys. He is a jackal-headed deity carved in stone 4,000 years ago, and he is a figure in modern tarot decks. His continuity is paradoxical, always the same, always changing. The god of silence has spoken through millennia without uttering a word. Anubis's rebirth in occultism and modern esoterica is not just a revival of old worship. It is a reinvention, a reinterpretation, a survival through transformation. He is no longer the god of necropolises in the Egyptian desert, but the archetype of transition in the global imagination. He is invoked by magicians in ritual, by pagans in prayer, by seekers in meditation.
His jackal head has moved from the tomb walls of Saqqara to the altars of modern occultists. In every form, he remains what he always was, the guardian of thresholds, the keeper of secrets, the guide through darkness into transformation. The modern world has not left Anubis behind in dusty museums or occult lodges. He has marched, sleek and black, into the bright lights of pop culture. From pulp novels and horror films to comic books and Hollywood blockbusters, the jackal-headed god has become one of the most recognizable figures of Egyptian mythology, his image endlessly reshaped for modern audiences. Yet, every appearance, whether as a terrifying monster, a dignified deity, or a mysterious guide, carries traces of his ancient character. The jackal in pop culture has become both a reflection of contemporary fears and fascinations, and a mirror of the role he has always played, a figure of death, secrecy, and thresholds. The first wave of his modern pop culture fame came through horror. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Western archaeologists opened tombs and filled newspapers with stories of curses, Anubis became the natural villain. He appeared in penny dreadfuls, in Gothic poems, in serialized adventure stories, always as the dark god who punished those who disturbed the dead. Writers who knew little of his ancient role reinvented him as an avenger, a figure of terror who stalked archaeologists and explorers. The jackal's head, exotic and unsettling, lent itself perfectly to illustrations of menace. Where Egyptians had seen dignity, Victorians saw monstrosity. Anubis was transformed into a horror icon, the symbol of the mummy's curse. Hollywood seized upon this image early. In the 1930s, as Universal Studios created its pantheon of monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, they added the Mummy, a story of an Egyptian priest who returns from the dead. Though Anubis himself did not appear, his presence lurked in the background. Statues of jackals crouched in tomb sets, hieroglyphs of his image adorned the walls, his shadow stretched behind the bandaged villain. For audiences, Anubis was inseparable from the horror of mummies. Even when unnamed, he haunted the genre as the silent god of tombs. Later films made him more explicit. In the mid-20th century, pulp horror and science fiction often depicted Anubis as a villain, an alien disguised as a god, a demon masquerading as a deity, a monstrous figure awakened by archaeologists' greed. These portrayals exaggerated his animal features, making him more beast than god. The jackal face, sleek and calm in Egyptian art, became snarling and feral on screen. His impartiality was lost, replaced by rage. Yet even in distortion, the themes of guardianship and punishment remained. He always appeared to protect tombs, to punish intruders, to embody the curse of Egypt. By the late 20th century, as popular culture grew fascinated with mythologies from around the world, Anubis began to shift from pure villain to complex figure. In novels, comics, and television shows, he appeared not only as a monster, but as a god with motives, sometimes an ally, sometimes a judge, sometimes a guide. Fantasy writers embraced him as a character in sprawling mythologies, placing him alongside Norse, Greek, and Christian figures in battles of gods and demons. He became a staple of shared fantasy universes, his black jackal head instantly recognizable to audiences who may have known nothing of Egypt, but who recognized him as the god of the dead. Television brought him into millions of homes. In cartoons and dramas alike, Anubis appeared as a figure of both menace and wisdom. Children's shows drew him as a guardian who explained Egyptian myths. Darker programs used him as a villain who threatened heroes in haunted tombs. Science fiction reimagined him as an alien overlord, blending Egyptology with space fantasy. In these portrayals, the jackal's face was rarely absent. The sleek ears, the elongated snout, the black skin became shorthand for mystery, for otherness, for the strange mix of death and divinity. Anubis was no longer just an Egyptian god. He was a pop culture archetype. Hollywood eventually placed him on center stage. In the 1990s and early 2000s, with films like Stargate and The Mummy Returns, Anubis appeared as both visual spectacle and narrative force. In Stargate, he was reimagined as one of the alien overlords who masqueraded as gods in ancient Egypt, his jackal head transformed into a mask of advanced technology. In The Mummy Returns, armies of Anubis warriors storm across the desert, their jackal heads terrifying in battle. These were not accurate depictions of the Egyptian god, but reimaginings that drew on his aura of fear and guardianship. Audiences who had never read a single line of the Book of the Dead recognized him instantly. His image had become universal shorthand for Egypt itself. In comics, his role expanded further. Superhero universes like Marvel and DC wove him into their pantheons. In some stories, he appears as a god who interacts with modern heroes, offering cryptic advice or posing challenges. In others, he is a villain to be fought, a demonic figure conjured by sorcerers. Independent comics often portray him as a complex anti-hero, neither good nor evil, but a force of balance who ensures that death is respected. These portrayals reflect the original Egyptian ambiguity. Anubis was never a king or tyrant, but a guardian, impartial, incorruptible. In pop culture, that impartiality is often reimagined as neutrality, making him a figure who can serve either as ally or foe, depending on the story. Video games have also embraced him, turning him into a boss to be defeated, a guide to be consulted, or a guardian of treasures to be looted. In games set in Egypt, statues of Anubis are almost mandatory, watching over tombs, guarding passages, appearing in cutscenes as judges of the player's actions. In fantasy games, he sometimes appears as a god of death, worshipped by cults or feared as a demon. His image works well in interactive form. The black jackal, silent and imposing, is instantly striking on screen. Players may not know his history, but they know he represents death and mystery. That recognition alone gives him power. Literature, too, has kept him alive. Writers of horror and fantasy use him as a symbol of the uncanny, the guardian of thresholds, the god who lurks in shadows. Some novels treat him respectfully, portraying him as a complex deity who helps souls cross into the afterlife. Others distort him into a villain, a demonic figure who commands armies of the dead. In both cases, his role is the same. He marks the boundary between life and death, a threshold no story can ignore. His popularity in literature reflects his adaptability. He can be noble or monstrous, ally or enemy, without ever losing his essential identity. What unites all these portrayals is the persistence of his image. The jackal face, the black body, the role as guardian of the dead, these have never been forgotten. Even when distorted, even when turned into a monster, the core archetype remains. Modern audiences may not know the details of his ancient cult, but they know him when they see him. He has become one of the most enduring mythological figures in popular culture, his silhouette as recognizable as Zeus's thunderbolt or Thor's hammer. This endurance reveals something about the modern imagination. In an age fascinated with death, horror, and the supernatural, Anubis is the perfect figure. He embodies fear without being entirely malevolent, mystery without being entirely unknowable. He is a figure audiences can fear, respect, or even love. Horror films cast him as the Punisher, fantasy novels as the guide, video games as the guardian. He can be terrifying or noble, monstrous or dignified. He is flexible because his ancient identity was always liminal, always ambiguous. The Egyptians themselves never made him king or tyrant. He was always the one who watched, who guarded, who preserved. That neutrality makes him endlessly adaptable. In pop culture, Anubis has moved from horror to Hollywood, from monster to archetype, from villain to guide. He is at home in haunted tombs and in blockbuster battle scenes, in comic books and in video games, in children's cartoons. and in occult novels. He has been distorted, reinvented, and celebrated, but never forgotten. The jackal still prowls the imagination, sleek and black, ears pricked, eyes unblinking. He has left the silence of Egyptian cemeteries to stride across screens and pages, but his essence remains. He is still the guardian of thresholds, the keeper of secrets, the figure who waits at the edge of life and death. Anubis has endured longer than nearly any figure of ancient religion. Gods rose and fell in Egypt, their cults shifting with dynasties, their temples abandoned, their names sometimes erased. Yet the jackal at the tomb door remained. He has been reimagined as son of Osiris, as rival of Set, as servant of Horus, as demon in Christian texts, as monster in medieval legends, as symbol in modern occultism, as character in Hollywood blockbusters. Through it all, he has never vanished. He still waits at the edge of cemeteries, in imagination if not in ritual, his sleek black body crouched over thresholds, his ears pricked for intruders, his eyes fixed on the dead. The question is why? Why has Anubis, more than so many other gods, survived? What is it about this figure that allows him to watch still? Part of the answer lies in his role. Anubis was never a god of empire or dynasty. He was not tied to a single city, a single king, a single temple. Ra depended on the sun rising. Amun depended on Thebes. Ptah on Memphis. When those centers fell, their gods weakened. Anubis belonged to cemeteries, and cemeteries never fell. Every family needed him. Every burial required his presence. The poorest farmer in the Old Kingdom and the greatest pharaoh in the New faced the same necessity: a body to be guarded, a soul to be guided. Anubis's impartiality made him universal. He did not belong to kings alone, but to everyone. That universality ensured his survival long after dynasties collapsed. His role was also practical. He was not a distant ruler, but an immediate guardian. Families prayed to him to watch their tombs, to protect their dead, to ensure offerings reached them. Priests wore his mask during embalming, invoking him in tangible rituals. He was present at the most intimate moment of human life: death. That intimacy gave him a permanence that grandeur could not. The sun might fail to rise, the river might fail to flood, kings might fail to rule, but death never failed. As long as people died, Anubis remained. Another reason for his endurance is his image. The black jackal is unforgettable. Unlike abstract deities or anthropomorphic figures that blend into one another, Anubis is distinct. His sleek body, upright ears, long snout, and black color create a silhouette instantly recognizable. To Egyptians, the jackal was a natural symbol of the cemetery, prowling the desert edges, scavenging near graves. To later cultures, the image was strange, exotic, haunting. To modern audiences, it is compelling, striking, dramatic. The jackal head is an icon that cannot be mistaken for any other. That visual power has carried him through centuries of reinterpretation. Anubis also embodies liminality, and liminal figures are hard to erase. He lives between categories, human and animal, life and death, silence and speech, god and demon, guardian and monster. Liminal figures are adaptable. They can be reinterpreted in new contexts because they are never fixed. Anubis could be adopted into Greek thought as Hermanubis, into Roman magic as a demon invoked in spells, into Christian imagination as a jackal-headed devil, into medieval folklore as a spectral dog, into modern occultism as a guide of initiation, into Hollywood as a warrior god. In each case, his essence as threshold keeper remained, but his form shifted. His ambiguity ensured his survival. The secrecy of his cult also played a role. Unlike gods of festivals and public temples, Anubis thrived in hidden spaces, embalming houses, desert shrines, whispered spells. His secrecy meant he was never dependent on public spectacle. When temples closed, his cult did not collapse. It had always been private, intimate, hidden. That made it easier for him to slip into the shadows of memory, to survive as rumor, as fear,
as whisper. Gods of spectacle needed crowds. The god of secrecy needed only silence. Silence endures. Psychology adds another layer. Anubis embodies humanity's deepest concern. What happens after death? Every culture has guardians of the dead: Hermes, Charon, Hades, Yama, the Valkyries. Anubis is Egypt's version of that universal figure. Because the question of death never disappears, neither does the figure who answers it. Anubis offers assurance. The dead are not abandoned. Cemeteries are not chaotic. The journey is guided. Even when cultures rejected him, they retained the archetype. Medieval black dogs, Christian devils, modern psychopomps, all are echoes of the jackal god. He endures because he addresses a question no culture can avoid. His impartiality also gave him resilience. Unlike gods tied to morality or favoritism, Anubis was neutral. He weighed hearts fairly, without bribes, without bias. He guarded tombs whether they were filled with gold or with straw. He embalmed Osiris, but also the humblest farmer. That impartiality made him incorruptible, and incorruptible figures are hard to dislodge. People may change their rulers, but they still need a fair guardian at death. Anubis provided that, and the memory of that fairness lingered even when his worship ended. Modern fascination with Anubis reflects this impartiality. In horror, he is terrifying but just. In fantasy, he is mysterious but not malicious. In occultism, he is stern but trustworthy. Unlike villains who thrive on cruelty, Anubis is frightening because he is fair. His judgment cannot be bribed, his guardianship cannot be evaded. That neutrality makes him compelling. He is not chaos but order, not cruelty but constancy. In a world where so much is corruptible, the image of an incorruptible guardian endures. Anubis's endurance also reflects Egypt itself. Few ancient cultures captivate the modern imagination as Egypt does. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the mummies, they fascinate endlessly. And among all the Egyptian gods, Anubis is one of the most visually striking and thematically compelling.
He appears in almost every portrayal of Egypt, from horror stories to documentaries, from fashion to advertising. He has become a symbol not only of death, but of Egypt as a whole. As long as Egypt captivates, Anubis will watch. What is striking is that his endurance is not only historical but emotional. People still respond to him. They see his jackal head and feel something: fear, awe, curiosity. His image is primal. It speaks to something beneath rational thought, the instinctive recognition of the predator, the scavenger, the guardian. The Egyptians understood this when they chose the jackal as his form. Modern audiences understand it when they cast him in horror films or place him on tarot cards. His image cuts through centuries because it speaks to instinct. Anubis still watches because his role is still needed. We may not embalm our dead in the same way, but we still guard cemeteries, still light candles, still whisper prayers, still ask what happens beyond the grave. We still imagine guardians who guide us. Whether we call them angels, psychopomps, or ancestral spirits, the role is the same. Anubis is simply the oldest and most vivid version of that role. His black jackal head, crouched at the tomb door, is the archetype of guardianship that endures in every culture. He also watches because we want him to. People today still place statues of Anubis in their homes, not out of worship, but out of fascination, out of a sense of comfort. They tattoo his image on their skin, wear him on pendants, invoke him in meditation. They may not believe in him as a god, but they still feel his presence as a symbol. That symbolic presence is enough. A god who began as a guardian of cemeteries has become a universal symbol of death's threshold, and symbols do not die. Anubis is eternal not because his temples survived, they did not, but because his role is eternal. Death endures, thresholds endure, silence endures. As long as humans die, as long as they bury, as long as they wonder what lies beyond, Anubis will watch. His jackal ears will prick at the edge of cemeteries. His black eyes will gleam in the desert night. His silent form will crouch at the door of tombs. He has shifted from god to demon to symbol to pop culture icon. But through it all, he has remained the same, the eternal guardian, the one who keeps watch. And so, even now, in a world of skyscrapers and satellites, his image still speaks. The jackal still waits in shadows, his head black against the desert sky, his gaze fixed not on the past, but on eternity. He is the reminder that death is not chaos, but order, not abandonment, but guardianship. He is the assurance that no one crosses the threshold alone. He has watched for thousands of years, and he still watches. The eternal guardian waits at the tomb door, silent, impartial, incorruptible. Anubis still watches because he always will.